A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
For weeks, I poured my heart and soul into building the dollhouse, meticulously choosing each piece of wood and paint shade, crafting it to look like a whimsical little home straight out of a fairy tale, knowing it was meant for my niece Lucy, who had always adored the imaginative world of dolls and play. When the dollhouse was finally complete, the hours spent sanding and painting were rewarded by a sense of pride and excitement, until my wife, Emma, walked in and let out a gasp that sent my heart racing. Her eyes lit up with an intensity that made my stomach drop. It dawned on me that she hadn't been speaking about the dollhouse's aesthetic, she had seen something sinister lurking within its walls. That night, long after I turned the lights off, I lay awake, haunted by the strange emotions the dollhouse had invoked, particularly Emma's fixation on it. No matter how much I reassured her that it was just a gift for Lucy, I saw the way she gazed longingly at it, how the corners of her lips turned down whenever I mentioned my niece. I decided to confront my memories of being a kid in my own dollhouse with my sisters, shaping our stories amidst miniature furniture and tiny ceramic trinkets, but now, the joy felt more like a weight tying me to something darker. It was the half-formed whispers echoing throughout our home, the ones I could never quite catch, that clung to my senses each time I entered the room where the dollhouse sat. I imagined it was a mere figment of my mind, until it started talking back. Emma wanted me to keep it, as if it were a living creature, begging for attention and love. Everything about it was unsettling, as if it knew secrets that I was too naive to understand. I tried to rationalize her odd requests for little changes, wanting me to add hatchways and secret rooms, but my hesitance turned to dread when I discovered a hidden compartment while searching for something else, feeling a chill as I uncovered a stack of dusty, yellowed notes, each written in my handwriting from years ago. How was that possible? I had never penned those words, yet they described my life in vivid detail, detailing moments I couldn't recall, feeding stories that were riddled with dark omens, twisted versions of myself fading away piece by piece, reflecting shadows of the girl who used to play with those dolls in our backyard. The next day, I decided to visit my childhood home, searching for some clarity, but all I unearthed was a photo of me at 8 years old, clutching a dollhouse that looked eerily like the one I'd just built. It dawned on me that the dollhouse was never just a toy, it was a vessel of our past, feeding on the very influence of my memories, crowding into the present, manifesting Emma's sorrow into something unfinished, something threatening. When I returned home, I could barely breathe, adrenaline coursing through me as I stood before the dollhouse, determined to finish what I started. That evening, I found Emma curled up in the living room, her cheeks damp, her gaze unfocused, the dollhouse casting twisted shadows in the dim light, like an ominous puppet master controlling our fates, and I found myself hesitating at the threshold, caught between my love for her and the growing fear of what I had unwittingly unleashed. I thought of Lucy, innocent and wide-eyed, and with a shaky breath, I confessed everything. I revealed that I could no longer ignore the haunting specter entwined with the dollhouse's elegance, with all its tightly woven charm. But as the words slipped from my mouth, Emma's face fell, her expression morphing from sadness into something far more sinister, with eyes glimmering under the dim glow like those of a predator. She didn't want to give the dollhouse away, she wanted to use it as a portal, tapping into the childlike wonder wrapped in a nightmarish veneer, to channel an unseen force that had held sway over us since we brought it into our lives, a force that wanted to be fed. The realization hit me like a freight train. I had become the antagonist in my own story, and every decision I made, instead of fueling my creativity, was giving life to a dark energy tethering us to the past, to Lucy. I needed to put an end to it, but how could I destroy something that had become part of the very fabric of our home? That night, drowning in dread, I thought of Lucy crying, clutching her own dreams in a world without shadows. I took a breath, consolidated my courage, and resolved to destroy the dollhouse once and for all. I had to be the one to reclaim my life, our life, but as I approached it, my hands trembling with an inexplicable reluctance, I swear I heard a voice whispering from the depths of the tiny doorways, begging me to put down the hammer, that it would be different this time if I just listened and let it show me the way. How could I fight the weight of wanting to belong? And in that moment, torn between my love for my niece and my wife, shadows cloaked in memories began swarming around the dollhouse, wrapping around me like a shroud, and I understood in my bones that the problem wasn't whether I was the asshole for keeping it from Lucy, it was that they had both deeply intertwined in a way I could never untangle without losing everything. It started with the usual dull routine of waiting for luggage at the carousel, a repetitive monotony that I had perfected over years of travel for my job. But on that evening, the dull thrum of the conveyor belt only added a rhythm to my growing impatience. My name is Eric, 33, an IT consultant, usually a face in the crowd, but that night, I became the guy whose life took a peculiar turn in a chillingly mundane setting. The airport was crowded, a sea of travelers as tired and bleary-eyed as I was. My eyes began to droop, lulled by the hypnotic drone of people's banal conversations and the mechanical hum of the moving baggage. Then, I noticed a bag, black, nondescript, similar to mine but not quite the same. It was like glimpsing a parallel version of a familiar face, with just enough differences to signal something was off. A small streak of red ran down its side, easily missed if you weren't squinting through exhaustion. But I was done waiting. I was a traveler well overdue to be home. Rationalizing that my mind, fogged by fatigue, could easily play tricks on me, I caught the handle of the bag and headed for the exit. My fingers tightened around the handle, a subconscious recognition that lingered unsettlingly in my gut. It was heavier than expected. The straps dug sharply into my palm, but I dismissed it, attributing it to the weight of the various chargers, travel books, and whatnot I frequently overpacked. As I left the airport, the air outside felt unusually clammy, the kind of humid chill that gnaws subtly on your spine. I thought it was just the change in climate. The taxi ride was uneventful, though I did feel an inexplicable urge to glance at the trunk where the bag lay. I attributed this to stress and the sense of having forgotten something important only to realize it would suffuse into a larger dread as the night wore on. The cab dropped me off, and I lugged the bag up the stairs with a huff, hearing something rattle inside eerily in contrast to the expected muffled thuds of clothing. Once in the safe familiarity of my living room, the apartment quiet except for the buzzing neon sign outside my window, the need to solve this minor mystery overcame me. I unzipped the bag and the rank scent of old metal, like rust mixed with something coppery, hit me before I even had the chance to look inside. The light over my kitchen table flickered, something else for the to-fix list, casting brief shadows as I fully opened the bag, spilling its contents onto the floor. Teeth. Hundreds of them. All shapes and sizes, molars, canines, and incisors tumbled forth, clattering onto the hardwood with a sickening, surreal sound like quicksilver rain. What in the ever-loving? My brain reeled, detaching from the scenario, trying to rationalize it as some prank or art installation, anything but the primal horror it invoked. My instinct was to scoop them back up, dump them, pretend it never happened, but I couldn't touch them. They glistened ominously in the bleak light. Among them was a notebook, a few loose papers tucked in, the only other item in the bag. With trembling hands, I reached for it, each movement a conscious effort against rising panic. Inside, scrawled in an illegible hand, were notes, diary entries maybe, and the single name Elise repeated, intertwined with paranoid ramblings facing madness, shadowy figures following, and teeth, always the teeth. Each page felt damp, as if tears or something more sinister had stained them. My hands shook as I read about teeth for protection, speeches in fear and reverence, events I couldn't fully understand. The descent into chaos was gradual yet inevitable as the narrative etched onto each page darkened, one entry detailing a dream of drowning in oceans of teeth, another raving that the teeth had once been inside all who had wronged Elise. Panic simmered into a clandestine terror that began whispering suggestions to my mind. If the bag wasn't mine, then whose would want it back? I imagined the door would open any moment, someone standing there demanding their terrible cargo. Thoughts spiraled into vivid fears of some cult-like upheaval at my doorstep, cloaked figures with missing teeth and obscured faces confronting my possession of their relic. The night stretched, days passing in worried isolation, each sound ominous, each glance out the window screen for followers. I became a prisoner of my own home, clinging to normality. Sleep came in jagged rifts, memories of ghosts with vivid smiles mocking my waking moments. A week passed, and food deliveries began frowning upon the lack of customers as I refused to even face the door. Meanwhile, curiosity weathered reluctance, leading me back to the notes, deciphering a life not mine, yet now unwelcome inextricable from my own. At last, anonymity turned to investigation. I found myself at a library, poring over records, an obsession curdling within. Elise. She wasn't real in the traditional sense, but a vast tapestry of small-town warnings and urban legends thread her story. Each place I sought her out, a collective memory of disappeared girls and smiling strangers haunted my inquiries, each leading to dead ends or further speculation. Always, relationships severed, tales of switches flipped and families torn by unspoken secrets leading back to the unexplainable dental treasures stored so questioningly by a tired IT consultant. So here I stand, writing this missive, desperate for resolution. Each entry an attempt to unravel what led my flight path to a bag full of horror. Whether misguided mix-up or fated encounter, I'm left dissecting a life not lived, yet wholly entwined with unknown sorrow. As I share this, dedicated whispers of conjecture to discover truth or simply cathartic in fear, the bag still waits. It's nestled in my storage, teeth and book untouched since that fateful day. My nights are interrupted by the echoes of that hideous cascade. All I can offer is a tale, sordid as it is, haunting, and a warning cloaked in puzzlement and shadows of misplaced belongings. Would you abandon it, forget it? Or has this gift, knowingly claimed unwittingly adored, an object worthy of lore, marked me for some unseeable fate where truth awaits amidst grinning ivory hosts? When my brother Joe asked me to co-sign for his car loan, I pictured his wide, pleading eyes, like when we were kids and he convinced me to sneak him extra cookies from the kitchen. It would have been the same this time, I told myself. I'd sign, and inevitably, I'd be stuck with the debt I couldn't afford. I said no. What unfolded was beyond anything I could have imagined. It started that night. As I drifted to sleep, a rhythmic tapping resonated from downstairs. Hearts pounding a synchronized beat, I crept down, expecting maybe a rat or a loose shutter flapping in the wind. There wasn't much to see in the glow of my phone flashlight, a mere flicker of movement in the shadows. The tapping persisted in the following days, growing louder, more insistent, like a sinister metronome tightening its grip on my sanity. I could almost hear Joe's voice, chastising me for denying him, but that was impossible. He hadn't spoken to me since our confrontation. Then the dreams began. In them, Joe's once familiar face was distorted, grotesque. He stood at the end of my bed, whispering accusations of betrayal. His words dripped with venom, each syllable sinking into my mind like daggers, making sleep an unbearable ordeal. "You locked me out," he would hiss. "Rejected me, left me stranded." I woke gasping, heart racing each time. The fear lingered into the daylight, an unwelcome specter. I tried to brush it off, the stress was getting to me, surely. But the nightmares were only the beginning. Physical manifestations followed, like my own rendition of a cursed tale. My reflections in mirrors appeared warped, showing a face that wasn't quite mine. The sound of phantom footsteps echoed through the hallway late in the evening. Electrical devices flickered and fizzled in my presence, and the light bulbs exploded inexplicably, plunging the house into oppressive darkness. My phone, the solitary beacon in the nightly abyss, displayed erratic behaviors, texts from Joe appearing, incomprehensible gibberish interwoven with snatches of coherent thoughts. "Help me," one read, pixels distorted into a chilling plea. Yet when I struggled to respond, always, the screen would crackle, shattering each message like so much brittle ice. I reached out to my sister, the voice of reason, in hopes of finding some explanation, medical, spiritual. I would have accepted it all. The moment she walked in, her face twisted with unease, just like she'd smelled smoke thick on a windy night but couldn't find the fire. She paced through the house, murmuring a residual prayer. "Joe wouldn't hurt you," she reassured, though her eyes belied a deeper fear. As she left, the door shuddered with a vigor nothing short of a tempest's breath. Things didn't get better. Mornings brought temporary reprieve, and I foolishly hoped that skepticism and sunlight would burn away the madness, yet every sundown reignited the curse. I tried ignoring it, tried offering Joe a symbolic apology in front of a half-empty makeshift shrine I cobbled together from childhood memories, hoping that somehow, wherever he might be, his judgment would cease. What I couldn't ignore was the crescendo of Joe's car pulling into my driveway one dim evening, its engine purring with malevolent familiarity. My breath caught in my throat as the driver's side door swung open, yet nobody stepped out. I froze, immobilized by the trappings of the impossible, eyes glued to an absence that I swore carried an intent to inflict harm. The car remained, an entity unto itself, omnipotent and heavy within the gloom. The realization struck that it was no car, it was Joe, or some echo of what he'd been, challenging me wordlessly. Trembling, I felt my refusal coil in my throat, a stubborn lump refusing to fade. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the emptiness. Nothing changed, the car still lurked, and with it, shadows whispered secrets ripe with my transgressions. Desperation drove me to frantically research curses, hauntings, any obscure lore that could lend a rational anchor. Everything suggested that my denial had invoked something much older, much angrier, resentment given a ghastly form. One entry stood out, detailing an ancient ritual to atone, a far-fetched solution yet, possibly my only hope. Under a full moon, I followed the obscure process as best I understood, line chalk drawings, whispers in tongues no living person should have heard, a single personal offering to appease the vengeful. That night, as I spoke the last phrase, my house shuddered, a shiver across timbered bones, and the darkness ebbed until it was nothing more than silence pressing against the walls. Peace slowly knitted itself into the fabric of my home. The car, mysteriously claimed by the dawn, vanished as abruptly and silently as it had arrived. Yet, even now, as I tap these keys, the truth haunts me. I should have just signed for the car. Some debts, it seems, lay deeper than paper, lurking in shadows unseen, in echoes of the choices we can't unmake. My sister went missing from a town that doesn't exist, and as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that I'm the only person left who remembers her, and the town itself, in any meaningful way. It all started a few months ago on a late summer evening when she excitedly told me that she'd found some obscure town tucked away in the mountains while exploring online. "It's called Silver Hollow," she said, her blue eyes sparkling with an almost childlike thrill, "and it's supposed to be a perfect getaway, known for its stunning landscapes and some weird folklore." I laughed it off, thinking it was just another one of her quirky ideas, but the more she talked about it, the more intrigued I became. She planned a spontaneous weekend trip, packed her bags, and left early one Saturday morning, promising me countless pictures and stories about the magical town. I waved her off, and as soon as she drove away, an inexplicable sense of dread began gnawing at my gut. I brushed it off as the normal anxiety of a protective brother, but a creeping unease lingered, enhanced by the fact that Silver Hollow couldn't be found on any map, nor had anyone I mentioned it to ever heard of it. Days passed, and I became increasingly concerned as she stopped answering my texts and calls. I convinced myself she was simply busy exploring, until 2 weeks went by without a single word from her. Panic set in, and I decided to take matters into my own hands. With nothing but her last known location from where she'd sent me a photo of an old, wrought iron sign that read "Welcome to Silver Hollow," I drove to the mountains, determined to find her. The air turned noticeably colder as I navigated narrow winding roads that seemed to twist into the very shadows of the trees. I remember pulling over at a small gas station to ask for directions, where the elderly clerk wiped his hands on his apron and looked at me with something akin to pity, shaking his head when I mentioned Silver Hollow. "That place is just a ghost story to keep the kids from wandering too far," he muttered, but his grim words only fueled my resolution. After an exhausting drive through dense mist, I finally stumbled upon a narrow path. The sign at the entrance looked weathered, and the whole scene had an eerie stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I ventured down the dimly lit path, flanked by tall trees that felt alive, watching, waiting. When I reached the town, it was like stepping into a time warp. Silver Hollow was oddly picturesque, with charming cottages that lined the streets and dim lamplights flickering gently. But something felt off. There was an unnerving lack of activity. I remember shouting my sister's name, hearing only the echo of my own voice bounce back at me, and my heart raced with a mix of fear and determination as I searched every building. The more I searched, the more I felt like I was being watched, like unseen eyes followed my every move. After a few hours, as desperation clawed at me, I stumbled upon a small community center that looked abandoned. Pushing the door open, I was engulfed by the darkness within, dust dancing in the beams of light that managed to sneak through the cracked windows. That's when I found it, a faded bulletin board covered in flyers for local events, but one flyer caught my eye and twisted my stomach. It was a picture of my sister taken months ago at the beach, smiling, and right below it were the words, "Help us find her." I could hardly breathe as a cold sweat broke out, but something in the corner of the board drew my attention, a crude drawing of a clotted heart surrounded by branches with the name Silver Hollow scrawled violently across the top. I backed away slowly, the dread stewing in my chest becoming a palpable entity, and as I turned to leave, I noticed something moving outside the window. I leaned closer to the grimy glass, my heart plummeting at what I saw, figures dressed in dark cloaks, their faces obscured, standing in a circle just a little distance from the entrance, whispering in hushed tones. The shadows felt alive, spreading like a stain. The aura was heavy, filled with a kind of malevolence I had never experienced. Panicking, I bolted outside, yelling for my sister. But only those cloaked figures remained. They slowly turned towards me, their movements deliberate, and in that moment, a horrifying realization settled in. Each figure was holding something small, something that glinted like glass, the very same glow I'd seen in my sister's eyes when she spoke of the town. Their heads began to nod in unison, slowly and rhythmically, and just as I turned to make a break for the exit, I felt something latch onto my ankle. I fell, a jolt of pain shooting through me, and as I turned to face my captor, all I could see was the face of my sister, her eyes lifeless and glossed over, tears running down her cheeks. "Don't leave, please," she whispered, and the panic swelled in my throat. They dragged me closer to her, and I fought with everything I had, but the shadows were overwhelming. The last thing I remember was being yanked through the threshold into something darker, the world dissolving around me, drowning in the echoes of my sister's pleas, and then, nothing. Now, I'm writing this from somewhere I can't quite place, a twisted reflection of my reality. No one remembers us, no one knows we're gone, and the town is still there, whispering our names like a cruel lullaby. Silver Hollow isn't just a place, it's a maw that consumes joy and memories and reshapes them into a nightmare for those who dare to seek it. If you're reading this, please, heed my warning, there's no town called Silver Hollow, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either lost or already claimed. I used to think that family dynamics couldn't get more complicated than my own, but then came the birth of my son, which opened up a nightmarish chapter I could have never predicted. It started with my mother-in-law, a woman defined not by boundaries but by her relentless need for control. As my due date approached, she made it abundantly clear that she had plans to swoop in as soon as I was discharged from the hospital, ready to take charge of everything from meal prep to diaper changes, under the guise of helping us settle into parenthood. I'll admit I was overwhelmed, a first-time mom navigating the monumental life change, but something about her eagerness felt suffocating, invasive even. I didn't want her hovering over me like I was some clueless child. I wanted to bond with my newborn, experience those precious moments without feeling like my decisions were being questioned at every turn. So, I set a boundary. I told my husband that while I was open to a daytime visit, I flatly refused to let her stay the night. He seemed caught in the middle, torn between his own mother and his wife, but we came to an understanding not without a tense exchange. Fast forward to the day I came home, exhausted, blood still fresh on my sheets and my emotions raw. We were greeted with a cheerful text from my mother-in-law saying she was just 5 minutes away. I felt a sudden sense of dread creeping in. I was still in a state of disarray, my body recovering, my mind frantic from sleepless nights and the overwhelming reality of motherhood. My husband offered to help me settle while his mother flitted around like a sparrow, offering unnecessary help. To my shock, she didn't just want to keep her distance, she wanted to keep me in her line of sight as though she feared I would vanish with my son if she turned her back. I felt trapped, my resolve wavering as she gushed over her grandchild, her voice brushing against the thin membrane of my sanity, and I knew I had to stand firm. When she said she couldn't wait to spend the night, I found my voice, shaking and firm, and said, "I really think we'll be fine on our own tonight. I just need to bond with the baby." The silence that filled the air was palpable, her smile faltered, and suddenly every moment of tension felt like a weight I was carrying. My mother-in-law's eyes narrowed slightly, not enough to be noticed right away but enough to send a chill down my spine. As I watched, a transformation occurred, the warmth in her voice faded, replaced by a skeletal politeness that felt more like a thin veil over simmering anger. "Of course, dear," she said, but there was a finality in the way she turned, eyes still fixated on the nursery where my son slept, innocent to the looming storm. I thought I had put my foot down, yet the evening felt calculated, filled with faint understanding but charged with an unspoken tension that had started to loom in our home. My husband sensed it too but remained hesitant to address the uninvited weight of expectation that filled the room. As soon as she left, relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Nightmares swept in like the tide of sleep deprivation. The first night at home should have been serene, filled with lullabies and the soft coos of a newborn, but it morphed into a harrowing reality. I was jetted between sleep and wakefulness, always with this nagging feeling of being watched, the creeping thought that maybe my boundaries had sparked a twisted response. I could hear my mother-in-law's voice echoing in my mind, sweet yet dripping with malice, rehearsed words about how no one could care for my son the way she could. Those words haunted me as I cradled my baby, studying the lines of his tiny face in the dim light of the nursery, but it was then that I felt something darker lurking just beneath the surface. Images of shadowy figures skittered at the edge of my vision, fleeting whispers flickered like a candle about to blow out, and every creak in the floorboards made my heart race with paranoia. Days turned into a blur of exhaustion mixed with newfound responsibilities, yet my mother-in-law's absence felt like an impending storm gathering strength. Each time my husband texted her, my pulse quickened, the idea of her returning sent waves of anxiety crashing through me. My mother-in-law showed up unannounced during the day under pretenses of delivering gifts for our baby, using every opportunity to pull the strings of family ties while pretending to respect my boundaries, but it felt like an elaborate game of chess. I felt suffocated under her gaze, every smile forward with my baby felt like one of her critiques, the fact that everything I did was wrong burned into my brain. That night, as I nursed my son in the nursery, the shadows shifted, and I felt the air change, subtly but unmistakably heavy, and for a moment, I convinced myself I saw a figure in the corner, erect and silent. I blinked hard, and it was gone. A trick of light, perhaps, but still, my heart raced, and paranoia clawed at my mind. In desperation, I sought comfort in the online world, and I stumbled upon the r/AITA subreddit, pouring my heart out in the most honest terms I could muster. It was cathartic to write, to elaborate on how it felt to defend myself against the clutches of family expectations, and almost immediately, the responses poured in. Some supported my stance, while others labeled me a heartless daughter-in-law, their words cutting sharper than I intended but solidified my conviction. That night, I scanned for every flicker in the nursery's shadows, unable to sleep, but not because of my son. It was the echo of the unwelcome comments, of holding the line against her, and, more sinisterly, the feeling that I was never truly alone in my home. Days passed, and just when I felt I was gaining control of my life, she breached my fortress, arriving uninvited again. Standing at my door with an eerie smile that sent chills dancing across my skin. "I just wanted to check in," she sang, her voice filling the hallway like a winter chill, and I could feel it, this pressure in the air that suffocated me, gripping my throat as though whispering, "You cannot keep me at bay." That night felt everlasting as I took refuge in the nursery with my son, unable to shake the feeling of eyes watching from the shadows. Strange sounds filled the house, creaks, whispers, and a lingering chill that made the air thick, heavier than lead, and through it all, her voice haunted every thought, twisting into darkened echoes until I could hardly tell if I was awake or dreaming. The darkness felt alive, shifting and turning against my very breath, and in the quiet moments between my son's breaths, something flickered at the edge, a shadow moving just beyond sight. I convinced myself it was fatigue or paranoia, the exhaustion of new motherhood weighed heavily on my shoulders, but something told me the presence in the room was far more real than I wanted to admit. I would get up, swaying on the border of sleep, each breath heavy with dread. The moment I trudged slowly toward the door, still wrapped around my child, I was met with a confrontation so agonizing that I felt my heart stop. There, standing at the threshold of my son's nursery, was my mother-in-law, dressed in the same eerie smile that made my stomach churn. "I just wanted to see you, dear. You're not alone, I'll always be here," she cooed, but her eyes winked a shadowy promise that chilled me to the core. In that moment, I understood. I had opened Pandora's box, thinking I could merely keep her away through boundaries, but instead, I unleashed something far darker. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as her grin twisted, an unnatural thing framed by the darkness that had settled around us, and no amount of reason could shift the knowledge that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. With that knowledge came the realization, I wasn't just battling my mother-in-law. I was fighting shadows that wore the faces of my loved ones, specters that weaved through familial love with a ruthless glee, eager to keep me wrapped in silken chains labeled as family. Living in the crisp air of rural New Hampshire has its perks, especially if you're someone like my dad, who adores hunting. Last Christmas, I decided to surprise him with something he always talked about but never got around to buying, an infrared scope. The gift was a hit, and we immediately embarked on a night adventure, eager to test out how the woods around our house would transform through the thermal vision. Barely outside, the chilling quiet enveloped us, the absolute darkness swallowing us whole. My dad, ever the experienced hunter, led the way quietly, with me trailing behind, heart pounding more from the thrill than fear. It all started as a mundane exploration, watching rabbits leap through bushes as crimson blobs and deer graze, their bodies etched in ghostly white against the cooler backdrop. As we trod deeper, the screen suddenly lit up with hues not native to these parts. A kaleidoscope of shifting colors danced toward the edge of the grove, moving erratically like they were floating. Dad lowered the scope, his breath hitching. "Must be something wrong with it," he murmured, passing me the device. But, as I peered through, the bizarre figures persisted, gliding frictionlessly in a peculiar, jerky rhythm. I felt a prickle of unease skittle down my spine. Their outlines shimmered like heat waves, almost humanoid but unnervingly elongated, with limbs too thin to be of anything natural. An icy panic clutched at my throat. Remembering tales spun by the locals about the ancestral woods, I wanted desperately to chalk it up to technology playing tricks. Yet, there was something undeniably corporeal in how these shapes weaved between trees, their presence raising an ancient, instinctual dread within me. My voice shook as I handed it back to my dad, hoping he'd have an explanation, any explanation, beyond my terrifying imaginings. "Get home," he whispered with an edge I had never heard before. We turned, his grip firm on my shoulder, pace quickening. But barely a few steps in, a high-pitched whistle swept through the silence, an unnatural tune that echoed chillingly, swelling until it drowned out the rustling leaves and my pounding heart. Dad's face was stone, eyes hard as he looked back through the scope once more. The shapes, now even closer, writhed unnaturally, distorting and dissolving into each other in some grotesque ballet. We could make out their faces, or what they passed for faces. There were no eyes, yet they seemed to watch us, eerily aware, the gaping voids for mouths enhancing the cacophony of their petrifying serenade. We were transfixed, limbs leaden as if rooted to the earth, until one figure broke away, stretching slightly taller than the last, its reach long and deadly precise. Dad shoved me forward with more force than I thought he was capable of. "Run! Don't look back," he shouted, the sternness of his command cracking through the encroaching terror. My legs found life and I sprinted faster than ever before, my mind numbly bridging my dad's presence behind me to the dreadful mass converging within touching range. The whistling crescendoed, violent, and maddening, clawing at my ears, but I couldn't risk glancing back. Breath ragged, chest ablaze, I hurled myself toward the distant line of our home. Within the safety of the walls, I whirled around, waiting, praying to see my dad rushing in behind me. Shadows danced across the windows as beams caught their motion, too many shadows, and none belonging to my dad. I fumbled with my phone, dialing 911 in my panic. My explanation was frantic, but they sent a unit immediately, too familiar with bizarre sightings people occasionally reported. Outside, the air grew stifling, vibrating with an unearthly hum as if culminating to some horrid finale. Minutes felt like eternities until flashing lights reflected through our windows, and I swore my knees would give way. The officer stormed in, weapons drawn, assuring me with their presence, but my eyes scoured the entry for my dad. Through the tangled reports and hushed communications, I gleaned they found nothing in the woods, that is, nothing living. The scope lay discarded, my dad's torn jacket not far from reach, a bow of finality tied in the curl of that wretched whistle echoing on the sidelines of my horrified consciousness. Days passed without any sign of my dad, the search called off begrudgingly. Locals whispered of past vanishings, citing grudging respect for the ancient guardians of the forest. I stayed long enough to pack essentials, bound by the restless yearning my dad might somehow return. As I locked the door for the last time, my heart ached with a singular resolve, never to return to those woods alone. Wherever he is, I just hope he's somewhere beyond this world's reach, because I certainly believe I've left a part of me lost amongst those terrible, watching trees. Confession today, I realized I am kind of a terrible miserable person. Funny how a single encounter can force you into a confrontation with your most loathsome self. To set the scene, picture a small town crawling out from the clutches of winter as spring timidly begins to urge the snow to retreat from its seasonal siege. I was seated in my usual spot in the corner of the coffee shop, a shoddy attempt at normalcy for someone who hasn't felt normal in as long as I can recall. It was one of those gray afternoons where the sun seems to forget its routine, and everything feels dipped in a monochrome palette. There was an odd bustle in the air, where people's chatter seemed to grow and swell, filling the room in a babel of mundane conversations. I welcomed these distractions, anything that could prolong my avoidance of the malignant thoughts that gnawed persistently at the base of my skull. I sank deeper into my chair and into what was becoming my customary feeling of melancholy, a pit so deep I feared I was mining my way to the literal center of darkness. A bell rang, announcing a new customer, but it was a laugh that captured my attention, albeit not in a pleasant way. The giggle was grating, like nails skimming tenderly across a chalkboard. My eyes were involuntarily drawn to the source, a young woman, no older than 25, her dark hair cascading like ink. She had an ethereal quality, gliding rather than walking, and there was a restless energy about her, as if she lived a second ahead of everyone else. She floated towards the counter, oblivious to the blade-sharp glares I directed at her from my secluded corner. She ordered her drink with an air that was both commanding and intoxicatingly carefree, a dichotomy that struck me strangely hostile. I hated her instantly, an irrational impulse that spread through me like wildfire. This reaction itself was distressing yet curiously familiar. My days of despising without discernible cause were embarrassingly frequent. I tried to dismiss her, steering my focus back to the book in my hand, words that swam into gibberish strings as I realized my inability to concentrate. She lingered, her presence a stubborn stain in my consciousness, relentlessly bending my mood into darker shapes. She took a seat not far from me, a pocket of energy in the bland stillness, absorbed by her phone, unfazed by the world demanding my attention for reasons I couldn't justify. My initial dislike unfurled into pettiness, threads of envy and a gory self-loathing that I wore almost as a second skin. She was a reminder of everything I wasn't, vital, joyful, connected to other people in a way I couldn't hope to be again. As I sat there stewing in my silent contempt, Her drink was ready, the barista calling out her name. Elara. An unusual name, notable enough to pull me out of my churning thoughts, its syllables singing as if her very name was meant to cast a spell upon anyone who heard it. I decided I had to leave, to escape this irrational fixation I had on someone who was completely oblivious to my anguish. I tugged my coat tighter around myself, like a cloak, and before I knew it, I was trailing behind her out the door, compelled against my better judgment by some unrelenting force. Walking a few paces behind her, I watched as she navigated the streets with the confidence of someone who owned the world itself. But it was her shadow that caught my eye, a peculiar thing that seemed to flicker in ways that defied the logic of light and movement, almost as if it were a separate entity, alive and cunning. It slithered over the pavement like oil. The rational part of me was convinced my over-imaginative mind, stirred by the ever-dimming glow of reality, was playing tricks. Yet there was a primitive, instinctual whisper that urged me to keep following, to seek whatever riddles might lie beyond the surface. We wove through town until she reached a secluded park, one mostly deserted as evening approached. She settled on a weathered bench, the kind that once held lovers and drunks, stories etched into its splintered wood, and resumed her phone fixation. It was only when this park was left as her only sentinel that she finally looked up, directly at me. The path I had taken as an agitated stalker suddenly became unbearably real, remorse seeping into my bones as her eyes, impossibly bright, locked with mine. I could have turned away then, severed my narrative from hers and returned to my mundane Sisyphean existence, but something compelled me, a deeper recognition of another presence shifted between the two of us. Her shadow, once an oily silhouette, detached itself entirely, taking on a grotesque form reminiscent of something primordial and foreboding. This wasn't a trick of the light. It was alive, a paradox made of screaming darkness and writhing limbs. My heart hammered in my chest as I witnessed this unimaginable horror, unable to rationalize the reality before me. Elara stood, unfazed by the monstrosity proceeding to emerge from what should have been nothing more than a mere shade. Instead, it smiled, an obscene mimicry of human expression, and for the first time, Elara spoke, her voice both human and imbued with a strange echo that was otherworldly. "You see it," she said, not a question, but a confirmation. I nodded dumbly, trapped in this unforeseen pact of seeing, brought about by my own miserable pettiness and intrusion. "Then you must be like me," she continued, her gaze steady and unwavering. Horror rooted me in place as I digested those words. "What does that mean?" I croaked out, my voice barely a rusty whisper, ashamed to hear the tremor betraying me. "The shadows, you've summoned them with your misery, with the way you wandered through life only half living. You've seen past the veil. Now, truer nightmares will always follow you." Her words sent cold spirals of terror through me, much worse than any condemnation or curse. Because I understood, deep down, beneath layers of forced apathy and detachment, I'd always known there was darkness in me, but not of this fantastical, living kind. As Elara walked past, returning from wherever she'd come, leaving me paralyzed, an onlooker both damned and enlightened, the world felt more terrifyingly tangible than I had ever known. And in those cold whispers of my mind, I finally comprehended why I had despised her. It was not because of her life, it was because she reflected, so clearly, the absence of light in me, of everything I'd failed to become through my cowardice and unwillingness to change. Alone, I sat on the bench, night folding over me like a shroud. The shadow lingered a moment longer, its presence sealing my silent confession of my terrible, miserable self-actualization before slipping away into the growing darkness, leaving me aware that in my heart's depths, something had fundamentally shifted. From then on, the shadows would find me. They would feast on me until I was consumed. And I wouldn't be alone. Not really. Not ever again. I always considered myself a rational person, not prone to flights of fancy or superstition, which is what makes what happened to me all the more difficult to process. On a particularly oppressive summer evening, the kind where the air feels thick and static, I found myself walking the less traveled path that cut through the woods behind my house. It was a path I'd walked 100 times or more, always reveling in the peace that only the solitude of the forest could provide. But that night felt different. The usual comfort of the shrouding trees seemed heavy, foreboding, as if the air itself buzzed with some unseen presence. Lost in thought, I almost stepped on it, a snake, elegantly poised and more strikingly colored than any I had ever seen. Its scales shimmered in the moonlight, hues of emerald and midnight blue intertwined in an otherworldly dance. What happened next still churns my stomach with disbelief. It spoke. Well, not with words, not exactly, but the meaning pressed itself into my mind with undeniable clarity and urgency. "I am New Sphera," it announced, "a god among my kind, once venerated and now forgotten by the tides of humanity. I blinked, refusing to believe my senses, but as I stared into its hypnotic eyes, a part of me, perhaps more instinctual than I care to admit, accepted a reality more expansive than I had been prepared to entertain. "You're skeptical," Newsfera continued, the words threading through my subconscious like silk, "but there was a time when you too would have recognized my divinity." I felt a pull then, an inexplicable yearning to understand the depths of this creature's proclamations. "Why me?" I questioned, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet of the night. "Why reveal yourself now?" The snake shifted, coiling its body in a way that seemed too fluid, too deliberate for any ordinary earthly serpent. "Humanity has lost its way, you've forgotten the old rights, the balance between your world and the unseen. I am here to remind you, to guide you back, if you so choose." It was madness, and yet, the part of me that clung to skepticism was awash with a deeper, primal fear, an understanding that humanity had indeed veered off its path, losing touch with something ancient and profound. "And if I walk away?" I asked, feeling the weight of the choice pressing in on me. Newsfera's eyes flashed, a glint of mischief, as if it were privy to secrets of the universe beyond my comprehension. "You could ignore me, dismiss this as a strange dream, a bizarre figment of the night, but the consequences ripple far beyond your species." I felt a chill, not from the night but from the gravity of its words. Despite myself, I was drawn closer, both to the snake and the implications of its promise. Yet doubt tethered me to the ground, keeping me from plunging headlong into belief. "Proof," I demanded, "give me something tangible, something undeniable." With a fluid elegance, Newsfera flicked its tail, and the world around me shifted, as if reality itself bent to its will. For an instant, I glimpsed through the layers of existence, faint outlines of other times, other places, shadows of creatures that danced on the peripheries of what we call real. It was breathtaking and terrifying, a vision so vast and intricate that I staggered under its weight. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone, and I was alone once more with the snake softly regarding me. "What you perceive as reality is but a fraction of the whole," it explained. "A grander scheme lies beneath, a tapestry in which all are threads." It was unthinkable to return to normalcy, to the mundane humdrum knowing what I now knew, or rather, what I now sensed. Newsfera had altered something fundamental in me, a shift that couldn't be undone. I didn't need further convincing, the truth lay between the beats of my heart and the spaces between breaths. "I'll help you," I agreed, feeling an unsettling sense that this decision had been predestined. The forest around us seemed to pulse in acknowledgement, an unseen force aligning at that moment, acknowledging the path set before me. Newsfera curled its length around an ancient tree, its presence familiar now, as if it had always been lurking just beyond my awareness, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "Together, we can restore the balance, rekindle the forgotten reverence between man and nature," it declared, and with each word, I felt the enormity of the journey ahead settle over me like a mantle. As it slithered away into the shadows, a part of me noted how the forest felt different, alive in a way it hadn't been before, colors more vivid, sounds more acute, as if every leaf, every whisper of wind hummed a silent acknowledgement of my newfound purpose. The rational part of me still balks at the story, hesitant to voice it, knowing it sounds like the delirious ramblings of someone lost to sanity. But deep within, I carry the unmistakable truth of that encounter, a truth that echoes across the silence of the woods wherever I tread. Now, days turn into nights and nights to days, each filled with signs and whispers that I didn't notice before. I'm in too deep to ignore it now. I am chosen, a conduit between worlds, and I cannot escape the destiny penned by a snake who claimed it was a god. Late one night, I found myself standing in line outside a decrepit old theater on the edge of town. Despite its crumbling facade and fogged glass windows, the place had drawn quite the crowd. People murmured excitedly about a new kind of cinematic experience being touted as life-changing. It was called the Mirage event, and entries were strictly limited. Invitations were whispered, not advertised. I'd heard about it from an older co-worker who swore it would unveil the perfect version of your life, showing you how to achieve it if you followed the steps they revealed inside. I was desperate. My life felt like a book stuck on the same page, and I hoped this could be my turning point. As I stood there, a routing marquee above us casting an ominous glow, I noticed the unconventional way the line was being monitored. A stern figure in a vintage usher uniform with a face like a forgotten dream seemed to float between groups, inspecting each person. The theater had promised the experience to the first 100 people in queue, and I was around the 85th. As minutes crawled by, the haphazard line formed naturally, but tension simmered when a frenzy of late arrivals started disputing who was there first. That's when a glimmer of an idea flickered in my mind, a way to gain an edge. Amidst the unrest, I casually suggested organizing the inchoate line based on physical position rather than mere arrival time, downplaying any notions of fairness while others debated. Surprisingly, my proposal took root, and people began to shuffle around according to the ragged physical line I started to establish. In the confusion, a couple ahead of me got pushed to the back of this newly formed line. Their protests were lost in a cacophony of rustling coats and disgruntled murmurs. It was as if the crowd shared a collective eagerness to order through chaos, so rationalizing any doubts was quickly glossed over. But as I slipped into the prime zone, a strange aura seemed to encircle the place. The air was impossibly thicker, oppressive, and the night colder, almost whispering my name. I didn't notice until later, when the theater doors creaked open, how an unearthly silence swept through the crowd. A hush that spoke of secrets guarded for lifetimes. It sent shivers down my spine yet pulled me in with an irresistible force. One by one, people started moving inside, disappearing into the shadowy maw of the Mirage event. I was buzzing with anticipation when the usher caught my eye, their gaze piercing through me like a blade. There was no malice, but something else. Almost as if they knew my thoughts and didn't mind, or maybe they wanted me to carry the burden of my choices inside. As I crossed the theater's threshold, the atmosphere changed instantly, a sense of dread mixed with curiosity enveloped me. The interior was an otherworldly blend of ornate deco from yesteryears and a technological setup that seemed straight out of a fever dream. Rows of luxurious, velvet seats stretched out before the screen, each adorned with a small plaque that somehow bore the name of the occupant, mine included, though I know I never shared it aloud. It felt intimate, heavy with the knowledge of strangers who were no longer strangers. When the lights dimmed further, a low hum reverberated from the walls, a signal that the miracle was about to begin. The screen flickered to life with images too vivid to be real, but too personal to dismiss as fiction. I witnessed snippets of my childhood, anniversaries that never happened, and a life of dazzling happiness and fulfillment, a dream reality, only it wasn't mine, it was what could be. This perfect life, with all its impossible ups and few downs, unraveled before me in a sequence that seemed just out of reach. Temptation took hold. Was this what the others saw? Or did these revelations change according to who was watching? I never got to ask anyone as their faces blurred, lost to their own visions. As the film progressed, offering pathways and decisions I had shied away from in life, my mind grappled with guilt and longing. I forgot about the choices made moments earlier in line placement, the usurpation of fairness for strategic gain. Here, my life and its paths were laid bare, scrutinized and judged not by anyone else but by myself. Each revelation felt like a judgment day compressed into fleeting moments. The conclusion of this eerie saga wasn't the end, rather, it instigated a weighty silence, enforcing a reflection many weren't ready to accept. People left the theater in various states of mind, some weeping, others frantic with excitement perhaps over newfound purpose, while a few were silent, their faces masks concealing the chaos within. As I exited, I was still processing, yet troubled by a singular thought that wouldn't let go. It dawned upon me, a chilling realization that in my quest for self-betterment, I'd potentially altered someone else's course in line, a metaphorical and literal theft of destiny. Had I robbed those people of witnessing their best paths for the night? Was my eagerness damning them to mediocrity? The usher's knowing gaze replayed in my mind, suddenly colder, more condemning. It haunted me as I drove home, the quiet ride back punctuated by the echoes of choices made. For now, the infinite possibilities seemed closed off, sealed by my hastily bought decision. Even the reflective Lady Moon veiled herself behind clouds, unimpressed by earthly matters. I wondered if, given the opportunity, I could revisit that line and change my approach. But deep down, I feared the most haunting truth of all, that opportunities such as these are one-shot, unforgiving of arrogance and haste. And so, as I lay in bed, surrounded by whispers of imagined perfections, I questioned aloud, was I the antagonist of my own life's story? My dreams that night were filled with spectral figures waiting in lines that never ended, each step echoing with something just out of reach, a tantalizing promise of a life edited by choice, or lack thereof. Growing up, my relationship with my mom had always been strained, but nothing compared to that fateful day when she barged into my life with a wild accusation that shattered everything I thought I knew about her and myself. I remember the summer of my college graduation, a time meant for celebration, when I arrived home to find her in the kitchen, her eyes intense and wild, as if she had just uncovered some grave secret, and without even saying hello, she demanded to know how far along I was. My confusion was palpable. I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking, until she turned to me, her face a mixture of anger and disappointment, insisting that she knew I was pregnant because my body was different, and the heat climbed from my chest to my face, filling me with incredulity as I shot back that she was being ridiculous, that I had been focusing on my studies, my future, and there had been no significant other in my life for months, and yet she wouldn't listen. The more I tried to explain, the more her accusations escalated, and soon I was yelling back, all the frustration I held, years of her controlling tendencies and disapproval, bursting forth like a dam that had finally given way, and I could see the look of betrayal forming in her eyes, as if my refusal to accept her delusions was a personal affront. I finally realized in that moment that this wasn't just about what she believed about me, it was about her own fears, her own desperate longing for a grandchild, and as I stood there, shouting in our tiny kitchen, I watched my mother fall from her empowered pedestal into something akin to a frenzied hysteria, each accusation weaving a web of paranoia around us, as if her belief in this miscarriage of reality was strong enough to infect my own mind. It felt like a waking nightmare, and when I slammed the door behind me, still echoing with the last of my spiteful words, I felt the weight of what I had done sitting heavy on my shoulders. In the following days, I couldn't shake her frantic ramblings from my head, the way she'd cling to me like ivy, whispering about the grandchild I owed her, dragging me to doctors and insisting on tests that only confirmed I was not pregnant, and still she refused to accept this reality, a delusion poisoning our conversations, growing darker, more vicious, each time we tried to discuss it, and I, struggling to maintain my sanity in this chaos, retreated into my room, surrounding myself with textbooks and the thudding silence that filled the void. She took it as a personal vendetta, the walls of our home crumbling under the weight of her expectations until that one particular evening when I overheard her on the phone, something sinister creeping through her words. "She doesn't understand. I'll make her see, I'll do whatever it takes," and with a chill creeping up my spine, I couldn't help but feel like I was watching a horror film unravel where I was both the protagonist and prey. A knot of dread formed in my stomach as nights morphed into frantic dreams, portraying my mother as a twisted version of herself, begging for a child she thought I was hiding, and on the days that followed, I avoided her like a contagious disease, fearing our interactions would snowball into something far worse, until one particularly harrowing night when I returned home late after studying, and I found the house cloaked in an unsettling silence that screamed danger, the kind of eeriness that sent shivers down my spine, every creak of the floorboards amplifying my anxiety. With my heart pounding, I peered into the living room, only to find my bed covered with baby clothes and toys, vibrant hues mocking my belief that I was still free from her grasp, and I felt a scream building up, barely holding it in as I stumbled backward into the hallway, and just then I heard a soft click behind me, the door swinging shut, trapping me in this labyrinth of my home-turned-prison. Panic surged through me, every instinct screaming to escape, and as I turned to face my mom, there was a frenzied look in her eyes that I'd never seen before, one filled with an unnerving kind of joy, as she cooed sweet nothings about me finally accepting my role as a mother, and I could hardly comprehend how we had spiraled into this twisted reality, where I was fighting to reclaim my identity, my agency, and I thought of calling for help, but shame weighed down my throat, suffocating the words that could have freed me. Her voice turned soft yet enticing, a manipulation draped in love as she reached for my hand. "Let's decorate the nursery together," the invitation hanging between us like a guillotine, and before I knew it, I was yanked back into the whirlwind of her delusion, where my protests became whispers. This systematic erosion of my autonomy transformed into a suffocating embrace, and it wasn't until I gathered enough courage to break away, pushing past her in a mad sprint toward the door, that I caught a glimpse of my mother, the woman who'd raised me. Morphing into something unrecognizable, a stranger cloaked in obsession, I finally opened the door and gasped in the fresh air that beckoned me towards an uncertain liberty, where the streetlights seemed to cast halos around potential safety. However, even as I fled, a nagging doubt followed, a gnawing realization that perhaps my mother was right about one thing. I wasn't pregnant, but I was lost, shackled by echoes of her incessant demands, and when I reached the end of the driveway, my legs trembling with adrenaline, I looked back one final time, fear and love battling in my chest, and in that moment, I knew that I might have escaped her physical hold, but the emotional tether would haunt me, still echoing in my mind, a question that lingered: am I the asshole for screaming at my mom, or was she never the one who lost grip on reality? It's been years since that night, and though I've managed to build a life beyond the fractures of our past, every now and then, just before sleep claims me, I hear her voice echoing through the years, reminding me of a mother's twisted love, forever intertwined with the shadows that lurk in the corners of my mind. It all started one chilly Friday night, the kind that coaxes you indoors with the promise of warm company and hearty laughter. My friend Sarah had invited me over for a small dinner gathering with her fiancé, Mark, and a couple of other close acquaintances. An opportunity to unwind, she had said, and I looked forward to it, eager to escape the mundane routine of daily life. As I arrived, the house felt inviting with its glowing candles and the aroma of roasted garlic wafting from the kitchen. The dining room was set with charming imperfections that revealed intimate touches, a wine stain on the tablecloth, mismatched silverware, and a bouquet of wildflowers in a tiny, chipped vase. It felt lived in, genuine. We exchanged pleasantries, settled into the coziness of mismatched chairs, and poured ourselves generous glasses of wine as light banter filled the air. Between sips, we shared anecdotes and old jokes that lingered like pleasant echoes, adding warmth to the space. The evening flowed seamlessly until Mark suggested playing a game, something he called Empathy Circle. Intrigued and with the wine loosening our inhibitions, we agreed, imagining it to be a kind of amicable confession session. He explained the rules: you write down a fear or secret on a piece of paper, fold it, and place it in a bowl. One by one, a paper is chosen, read aloud, and the group offers support and insights without judgment. Innocuous enough, it seemed, and amidst giggles and conspiratorial glances, we all scribbled our deepest anxieties. As the first slip was opened, a nervous energy settled over us like a mist, both thrilling and slightly ominous. "I'm afraid of being forgotten," read Sarah, her voice tender. We murmured empathetic words, sharing stories of how memory connects us. The game progressed with confessions of fear of failure, frets over losing loved ones, and anxiety about the future. Each was met with warmth and understanding until Mark picked up the last note. His fingers paused over the crumpled slip, and I noticed a shadow cross his face. "There's someone in the basement," he read, his voice tight, eyes inadvertently flicking to Sarah. Laughter bubbled up nervously as we tried to guess who among us was playing a prank, yet no one claimed it. A beat of silence hung in the air, creeping up on us with its strange weight, before Mark laughed it off as some odd joke. But something in the flicker of his eyes was growing hard and unresolved. We moved on, or tried to, brushing away the unsettling suggestion as the night deepened. Yet, a peculiar sense of unease lingered, a chill that stood in direct contrast to the evening's earlier warmth. As casual conversation resumed, I found my eyes involuntarily drawn to the basement door, its knotted wooden surface suddenly more menacing, as if holding stories I was not meant to hear. Trying to shake off the disturbed feeling, I poured myself another glass of wine, but the fear lingered, unwelcome and insistent. It wasn't just whisper-soft suggestions of unease that hung in the air, it was the sense that something was observing, something that had slipped into our world unnoticed, quietly seated among us. Despite us changing the subject, despite the laughter trying to pierce the odd gravity seeping into the room, I noticed our eyes constantly, furtively flicking to the basement door, drawn to it as if by some magnetic force. Then, for some reason, the conversation stopped, as if on cue. The chatter died a stumbling death, and in that echoing silence, we heard it, an unmistakable thud from below. My heart dropped to the soles of my feet, echoed by the collective holding of breath. Mark's presence at the head of the table suddenly seemed remote, like an anchor snapping free from its moorings. Sarah's face had drained to an ashen pallor, eyes wide but silent, seeing shadows I could not perceive. Someone among us chuckled nervously, suggesting it was perhaps the house's old pipes or foundation settling, but no one truly believed it. Mark's gaze locked with Sarah's, communicating everything and nothing in a microsecond intimate exchange. Slowly, he stood, trying to feign control, his voice calm as he suggested that he go check alone. Instinct protested, something primordial within me voiced that no, it was unwise to let him face what lurked beneath us alone. And yet, lurid curiosity propelled us all to stand and follow him, irrational camaraderie binding us together against the encroaching dark. Reaching the basement door, Mark hesitated, hand trembling on the handle, and with a deep breath, flung it open. Shadows pulled at the bottom of the stairs, and the light switch flickered reluctantly to life, illuminating the contours of a space cluttered with relics of life, a forgotten tricycle, boxes marked in faded Sharpie, a half-assembled treadmill. Ordinary, also comfortingly ordinary. Tentatively, we descended, each step creaking underfoot with conspiratorial whispers. I held my breath, expecting some grotesque apparition to unfold itself from the gathering twilight, but there was nothing, only the basement clamoring with its odd normalcy. Reassured or resigned, we laughed nervously at our irrational fear, at the way shadows can twist the mind's fabric into knots of absurd fantasies. We returned to the living room, where the air felt lighter but fatigued. Someone proposed dessert, and the normalcy of it tasted sweet on my tongue until the power flickered and every light sputtered out, plunging us into a thick, palpable darkness born of void and fear. There was a murmur, a ripple through the group like shockwave. Then, a voice spoke from the darkness, not one of ours, raw and rasping like stone on glass. It drew a breath that sounded wet and cavernous, a subterranean echo of torment we hadn't fathomed, and said simply, "You found me." Panic rose with tangible panic, like a tide ruptured free of its dam, and my heart surged into a loud, hammering chaos. Someone screamed, maybe it was Sarah, and chaos erupted, bodies scrambling for doors, limbs crashing into furniture, the air thick with the acrid scent of fear. As light crashed back into the room, our eyes groped around, searching for the source of horror, every crevice scrutinized, but those shadows had retreated and folded themselves into the comforting confines of familiar things. The whispers were gone, silence sealing their abrupt exit. We stood silently, breath hitching, unity frail but unbroken as the real was swept beneath an oppressive eye of unexplainable dread. Perhaps it had been orchestrated within minds oversteeped in fear, perhaps it was the unwelcome remnants of some forgotten occupant now angered by our intrusion. I thought of the note again. The warning, "There's someone in the basement," and my skin flushed cold. We never did find explanation or reason that satisfied the betrayal edged into reality in that moment. Windows were checked, locks bolted, lights left burning through the remainder of the tormented night. Surrounded by friends, yet each of us bore the chill anchor of isolation, understanding that parts of ourselves had crossed into shadows we'd never entirely withdraw from, imprint etched indelibly on the map of our shared resilience. No one mentioned the note again, nor the presence we had glimpsed with the heart rather than the eyes. In the harsh light of morning, uneasy smiles and goodbyes held the unspoken pact of becoming regardful of the unearthly borders never again to be disrupted, boundaries where reality thins and something watches with eyes of terrible yearning. As I left, I couldn't shake the ominous feeling of having dined with a party much larger than we had anticipated, and the certainty of knowing it was not a presence that would easily let go. We had been cast adrift from safety, transient waves of uncertainty guiding our way back to mundane lives where every basement door inevitably held tales best left untold. I never thought I'd be the sort of person to post on a subreddit like No Sleep, but last night was so bizarre, so terrifying, that I can't shake the feeling I need to talk about it. I worked the night shift at a small, old hotel in a town that seems stuck in time, where the creaking floors and dim lighting make guests uneasy, but they never seem to leave without an odd story to tell. It was just after 2 a.m. when the door swung open and a gust of wind sent an unsettling chill through the lobby, signaling the arrival of a guest I didn't recognize. He had an almost otherworldly presence about him, tall and gaunt with sagging skin that clung to his bones like an old coat. His clothes were a faded gray, reminiscent of the hotel's peeling wallpaper, and his eyes, dark and sunken, seemed to absorb the flickering light above us. I forced a smile and welcomed him, hoping that I'd somehow get a good tip. But as soon as he spoke, I felt a jolt of unease travel down my spine. His voice was an echo of forgotten whispers, like he was plucking memories from the very air around us. "I'd like a room, please," he said, as if the act of renting a space was a mere formality in our strange little world. I began the usual procedures, but when I asked for his identification, he only stared at me with an unsettling intensity that made my heart race. "I don't need to prove who I am. I'm here to stay," he replied, and in that moment, a flicker of fear ignited in my gut. Against my better judgment, I booked him in, handing over the key which shimmered oddly in the pale light, and pointed him towards the staircase. That was when I noticed the other guests watching, their expressions a mix of curiosity and dread, but just as quickly as I caught their gazes, they turned away, as if they had all come to a silent agreement not to acknowledge what was happening. As the man ascended the stairs, I caught snippets of his movements out of the corner of my eye. He moved unnaturally, gliding rather than walking, like he was part of the shadows themselves. Then, before I could settle my nerves, another guest screamed from the second floor. I rushed to the staircase, but the hallway lights were flickering ominously, casting long shadows as I sprinted up the steps. The scream had echoed through the building, reverberating in my skull like a drumbeat. I reached the second floor and saw the worried faces of guests peeking out from their rooms, their eyes wide with terror. I banged on one door, and an elderly woman answered, trembling. "It's him," she gasped. "He's not normal." My heart raced as I turned, looking down the corridor where a door had just slammed shut, room 207, where the strange man had gone. I slipped a key from my pocket and the door opened with a defiant creak, revealing the dim interior. The bed was unmade, the chair overturned, and in the corner, a mirror reflected nothing but darkness, as if the glass had swallowed all light. I stepped inside and instantly felt suffocated by an oppressive cold. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing back to me, taunting. Silence hung in the air, thick enough to choke on, and with my heart pounding like a war drum, I turned back toward the door. But something slammed it shut behind me. No wind, no force of nature. Just a demonic insistence that I could not leave. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned back to face the room, still frozen in fear, and that's when I saw him, standing before the mirror, his back to me, but I could still feel those hungry eyes boring into me. "What are you?" I managed to gasp, but he merely smiled, his mouth stretching wider and wider until it looked like his face might tear apart at the seams. "You'll find out soon enough," he hissed just as the lights flickered one last time. A moment later, they went out completely, leaving me ensconced in the thick darkness, swallowing my screams. I fumbled for my phone, praying for even a glimmer of light, but the screen remained black, and I could hear the man whispering to the void, ancient words slipping from his lips like the filth of forgotten graves. Panic surged through me and, fueled by adrenaline, I charged toward the door, slamming into it with my shoulder. It didn't budge. The words he chanted grew louder, heavy with a malevolence that twisted my insides. I turned back to the mirror, praying for some kind of escape, and that's when I saw it, a reflection, a figure standing behind me, faceless and terrifying, shrouded in a cloak of shadows that seemed to pulse with life. It reached out, fingers elongated and claw-like, grasping for me, and all at once I knew I was summoning something far worse than the man, something that had been waiting for years, perhaps centuries, for a chance to escape. In that dark, suffocating room, the atmosphere shifted, the room closing in like an ever-tightening noose, and that's when I heard the screams again, this time from the guests, thrumming through the very walls of the hotel, and then, the lights exploded back to life. In that brilliant illumination, I stumbled forward, flinging the door open and bolting into the hall, where the frightened faces stared back at me with an undeniable horror. The room was empty, the mirror reflecting only the disarray of what had transpired, no man, no shadow, nothing but the remnants of a nightmare. I fell to my knees as the guests began to whisper amongst themselves in a frenzy, their murmurs blending into one long, echoing dread. As I gasped for air, grasping at the curtain of realities I just crossed, the door to room 207 swung open slowly, and there stood the man, no longer gaunt but somehow more grotesque, and with an unsettling grin stretching across his face. He only said one chilling sentence, "I hope you don't mind sharing. Because I'm just getting started." It's been hours since that night, and the hotel hasn't been the same, guests checking out without explanation, leaving their belongings behind as if fleeing some unseen terror. I can't describe it, but there's a change in the air, a whisper of a promise that the man will return, bringing something with him that will seep through the cracks of this place. I'm terrified to sleep, terrified to close my eyes for fear that I might not wake up again, and the thought of that guest lurking somewhere in the shadows fills me with an icy dread. So here I am, posting this, hoping that, maybe by sharing, I can prevent it from getting worse. I don't want to be the last one left standing. If you see a hotel room that looks too good to be true, or meet someone whose smile feels like a hollow void, turn around and run, because there are things out there that shouldn't be welcomed in, and believe me, once you let them in, they don't like to leave. When my sister called me in a panicked voice that night, I knew something was wrong, but I had no idea how deep the rabbit hole would go. She was desperate, her husband had left her, and she was about to lose their house, and naturally, she wanted to move her 2 kids in with me, but I felt that I'd reached my limit. I loved her kids, sure, but my small 1-bedroom apartment wasn't suitable for 3 people, not to mention that I was drowning in my own problems, and I couldn't handle the weight of their grief on top of my own. But when I told her no, I expected anger, maybe a little guilt, not for her to cry as though I ripped her heart out. Still, I stood my ground, making it clear that I wasn't equipped to be their emergency shelter. She hung up in a fury, and I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Maybe I was the asshole for refusing to help family. Days passed and I kept expecting an apology or at least a civil conversation, but instead, I started receiving strange texts, vague enough to send shivers down my spine. They were from my sister, but the words were distorted, too many letters replaced with numbers, and the angry tone shifted to something darker, almost sinister, until one message read, "I see the way you look at them, and they're not safe with you." Anxiety gripped me as I hurried to her house, hoping to find her and the kids safe, my heart pounding as I approached her front door, which hung ajar as if inviting me into a nightmare. The moment I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted, a chill creeping under my skin, the kind of feeling you get when someone's watching you, but I couldn't see anyone, just the eerie silence that drowned out the echoes of my footsteps on the wood floor. I called her name, but all that answered me was the sound of a child whimpering and the rhythmic tapping of something metallic. My instinct screamed at me to flee, but there was no retreat now. I ventured deeper into the house, the psychological weight pressing down like a suffocating fog, and that's when I noticed the walls were covered in what looked uncomfortably like hastily scrawled notes, warnings perhaps, chaotic messages that repeated variations of "they're here, look behind you, and it's not safe." But my gut tightened into knots as I read them, piece by piece, feeling as if they were written for me. Suddenly, I heard another sob, clearer this time, emanating from the basement, and against every logical instinct I had, I moved toward it. Upon reaching the door, I felt nauseous with dread, the dim light spilling onto my weary face like an accusation, but I found myself gripping the doorknob, twisting it open despite my heart's protest. It creaked open to reveal a staircase descending into darkness, and there lying at the bottom was my sister, unmoving beside an upended child's plastic chair. Panic surged through me. She looked pale and ghostly as if all color had drained from her skin, and as I rushed down the stairs, I caught sight of her eyes fluttering open, not in the recognition of a sisterly bond, but the wild, fearful stare of someone trapped in a waking nightmare. It was only then as she whispered to me that they were coming for her kids. They were already outside, each word dripped with desperation, yet the way she spoke felt unnaturally soft, hypnotic even, inviting horror into my heart. I reached for her, ready to pull her away, but found myself rooted to the spot when I heard the faint scuttling above us, like small claws scraping against the floors. The building anxiety made my mind whirl, memories of her text swashing back over me, the horrors I had dismissed suddenly all too real as feelings of clenching dread rose from my gut to my throat. Were those the "they" she referred to? Could she really mean what I thought she meant? As I tore my gaze from her, back up the stairs, I saw two figures watching me, children. No, not my niece and nephew. Their faces were too gaunt, their eyes hollow. Even from that distance, I sensed they weren't just staring out of fear but with something else, something that twisted inside me, a feeling that suggested I wasn't at all safe from what awaited me. "You let them down," my sister murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're hungry." My blood ran cold as the children moved in synchronized steps, the same way a predator might circle its prey, and before I could react, her eyes turned into a pleading abyss. "You're supposed to protect them." It was a command that coursed through my veins like ice, and in that moment of vulnerability, I realized I might have been the asshole all along, but it was too late. Almost as if summoned, shadows rushed down the stairs, enveloping her, leaving me paralyzed in despair. The last thing I glimpsed was the flash of their hollow eyes reflecting the dim light of my phone against the darkness. As screams echoed from the basement, I burst into a panic-fueled sprint for the entrance, my mind screaming to get out, but the door slammed shut just as I reached for the knob. I desperately turned the handle, pulling with all my might, but there was no escape. The darkness crept in as I heard her voice resonate in my head, the twisted reverberation of a sister I thought I knew telling me how every choice has its price, and the price for turning my back on them would turn out to be my own life. I never saw my sister or her kids again, and now I'm trapped here, endlessly texting strangers like you about the days I spent locked inside my own conscience, forever wondering if I should have told my sister yes, or can I face the reality that perhaps, sometimes, the words "no" may write your name into a nightmare that you can't wake up from. When I found out my wife was pregnant, I felt a rush of joy that quickly spiraled into overwhelming anxiety about how to be a good father, but that was nothing compared to the dread of planning her baby shower under my mother-in-law's watchful eye. As the day approached, I tried to stay out of the way, letting my wife and her mother make the decisions, but every time I stepped into the living room to check the decorations, I could feel my skin crawl at the sight of my mother-in-law, Susan, meticulously arranging gifts with a smug smile etched across her face. She was one of those control freaks who believed her way was the only way, and I started to worry that she would hijack the whole celebration with her overbearing presence. It turned from excitement to a stomach-churning tension, and on the day of the shower, I could hardly breathe under the weight of anticipation. Guests arrived, and the atmosphere was tinged with the scent of lavender and vanilla. My wife looked radiant, glowing with joy as she welcomed her friends, and I silently vowed to make this day special for her. But Susan was relentless, moving through the crowd, issuing orders disguised as suggestions, and adjusting everything from the seating arrangements to the punch recipe. I could feel my patience wear thin as she critiqued the decorations, calling them childish and not suitable for our family legacy. I bit down on my tongue as I watched my wife's smile falter, and a fuse inside me began to spark. All of a sudden, I was standing next to Susan, who was fussing over the gift table, oblivious to the tension brewing within me. "Maybe if you'd let me take care of it, it would be done right," she said, her tone dripping with condescension as she glanced at me. Something snapped, and before I realized what I was doing, I yelled, "Why don't you take your controlling personality and go home?" The room silenced. As the laughter and chatter faded into an uncomfortable hush, my heart pounded as I saw my wife's eyes widen in shock. Susan's face twisted with anger, and she opened her mouth to retort, but I continued. "You're ruining this for her. This isn't about you, it's about my wife and her future." My words rolled off my tongue, fueled by sheer desperation to reclaim the joy of the day. I felt a mix of adrenaline and guilt surge through my veins as I kept my gaze steady, ready to defend my wife against the wrath I knew would follow. "I will not let you embarrass her any longer," I added, and in that moment, a tense standoff filled the room. Faces were turned toward us, caught between shock and anticipation, and I could feel the weight of everyone's gaze like the oppressive chill of an ominous storm. Susan's face reddened as she grabbed her bag, glaring at me with an anger I had never witnessed before. "Fine, but you'll regret this," she spat, and, breathtakingly, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her, leaving a powerful silence in its wake. My wife stood frozen, shock etched across her face, and for the briefest moment, I feared I had just damaged the one thing I held most dear. I stepped toward her, ready to comfort her and chase away the shadows that loomed ominously in her eyes, but before I could mutter a single word, she burst into tears. I quickly wrapped my arms around her, and despite the chaotic residue of what had just happened, she whispered that she was grateful I had stood up for her, which filled me with a sense of relief mixed with lingering dread about the fallout. As the party gradually resumed, laughter returned shakily, though it felt haunted, and we all moved cautiously forward, making light of the situation while I could almost hear Susan's voice ringing through my head, threatening our happy moment. When the shower ended, I saw my phone light up with messages, friends, family, and then, like a nail piercing a balloon, a text from Susan that read, "It's over. You're not welcomed in my family anymore." My stomach twisted, but I gripped my wife's hand, assured that we could deal with this. But week after agonizing week passed and her estrangement burned like a slow fuse, turning family gatherings into landmines. She texted us, excluding my wife from family events, and I could feel the mounting anger wrestle with my guilt as time went on. I never intended for it to go this far. I wanted to protect my wife. I knew I had made the right decision, yet the isolation loomed larger than I anticipated. My wife's face sometimes bore an uneasy sadness, a yearning for the relationship she once had, and amidst the chaos, I questioned my instincts. Was I the villain in this story? I thought I was doing what any lover would do, shielding my partner from her mother's toxicity, but guilt was a suffocating blanket I couldn't shake off, festering inside me like a rotting bone. As we prepared for the arrival of our newborn, every baby-related discussion twisted into anxiety. I could sense the impending family conflict bubbling below the surface like a pressure cooker. The day we next saw Susan was in the hospital, where I had insisted we keep things private, but when she found out we'd decided to go with a home birth, she barged in as if my wife and I were simply children playing house. I sat there, waiting outside the delivery room as she pushed the door open, and the moment I saw her face, a silence fell. My hands balled into fists. I knew she wouldn't let this one go without sparking a scene. "You think you can just deny me my right to be a grandmother?" she shouted, her voice fierce as thunder, but in those shadows of the hallway, something shifted in my wife. Though she was exhausted, something ignited in her, a fierce light I hadn't seen in weeks. "This isn't about you, Mom," she said, her voice cracking but resolute. "It's about my family, the one I've built. If you can't respect that, you are not welcome here." I stood beside her, a support anchored in new strength, as Susan's face turned pale with disbelief. And as I watched my wife stand firm against her mother, I felt the tide shifting, hope replacing despair, love emerged, unfurling against the chaos like a new bloom in a garden long neglected. We took that leap, drawing a line in the sand, one that I believed marked the start of a new chapter, a fierce declaration against the toxic pull of familial obligation. And as the shrill cries of our newborn filled the room, I knew we had made the right choice, that love was the only legacy that mattered. I never thought I'd find myself in the middle of anyone else's drama, let alone become the villain in my own son's love story, but there's been this creeping horror shadowing my life since that night. It started innocently enough, with my 16-year-old son, Jacob, coming home one evening, eyes aglow, announcing that he had a girlfriend. Sophia was her name, a girl with striking blue hair and a personality that seemed to fill the very air around her. I could tell from the start she was trouble, but then again, what teen girl isn't? At first, I was just the hopeful parent, envisioning school dances and awkward family dinners, but as the days turned into weeks, my sentiments shifted. I noticed how her laughter would echo from his bedroom, the playful banter dripping with a familiarity that left me unsettled. My husband is never home due to his grueling work schedule, and I was left alone to navigate the minefield of teenage relationships. When I first heard the rumors from other parents about things happening behind closed doors, I said nothing. I reasoned it was just kids being kids, quickly swept away by the tides of hormones and puberty. But then came the day that tested my patience, my morals, and my sanity. Jacob, with his hopeful gaze, casually asked if he could invite Sophia to spend the night. My gut churned at the thought, trying to suppress the adult instincts roaring within me. I wanted to scream some parental platitudes about responsibility and respect, but instead, I went quiet. The night of the visit arrived, and I prepared a playbook of rules, laying down the law with a shaky voice about how there would be no closed doors, no funny business, only PG-rated card games and midnight snacks. I watched as Sophia rolled her eyes, but Jacob nodded along, truly believing we could play house without crossing boundaries. As the hours passed, I could hear them laughing through the thin walls, the sound clashing with my anxiety until it festered into a fever pitch. I had one eye on my watch, and the other on my phone, biting my nails down to the quick, when I finally resolved to do something that would spell the disaster waiting to unfold. I marched upstairs, heart pounding, and threw open the door without a second thought. I can still picture the sight that greeted my eyes. Jacob and Sophia froze on the edge of his bed, layered together like two puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. My gut twisted into a tight knot of dread and embarrassment, infuriated at my own impulsivity. I barked at them in a voice I hardly recognized as my own. "What do you think you're doing?" The startled expressions on their faces tipped the scales from shock to anger within moments. Jacob accused me of invading his space, of not trusting him, while Sophia's lip curled in disdain, making it clear I was the meddling villain in their love story. They squared off against me like I was the enemy, and in a fit of rage fueled by parental instincts and the panicked beat of my heart, I shouted more than I should have, an unintentionally hostile outburst that left them both speechless. "If you can't respect my rules, then you can't have her here at all." I had never seen Jacob's eyes, usually filled with joy and mischief, darken so quickly. He lashed back at me with a ferocity I didn't expect, hurling insults and swearing I had ruined his life. In my mind, I was just safeguarding my son's future. Did he not care how this would affect his education or his future friendships? The remaining hours that night became a haunted silence. After Sophia left, there was no comforting snuggle on the couch or heartwarming family moments. It was a chasm of resentment settling between us. Jacob's demeanor changed overnight. He started sneaking out, arriving home only when he felt like it, returning reeking of rebellion and adolescent woes. Our once easy conversations became cold exchanges, thick with unspoken resentment, and I found myself tiptoeing around my own home, desperate to avoid another clash. I couldn't help but wonder if Sophia had whispered poison into his ear, or if he had merely turned to her as an escape from my overbearing nature. Days turned into weeks, and the shadows thickened further, weaving anxiety and guilt into nightmares where I would wake in a fit of sweat, panicked that I had made the wrong choice. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, a week before Jacob's birthday, I got an unexpected call from the school. The voice on the other end delivered a blow that twisted my insides. "We need to talk about Jacob and Sophia. There's a serious issue we need to address." My heart raced as I pictured what disastrous scenario might unfold. Were they caught? Were they in trouble? When I arrived, the words hit me like a freight train. They'd gotten caught in the back of a school dance, pursuing their own version of love in a world that wouldn't understand. I barely made it through the conversation with the principal, blurred images of Jacob's fighting back tears merging with my own horror at the thought of everyone knowing. I returned home, my breath shaky, armed with the understanding that I had unwittingly pushed him further into Sophia's web. That night, as I lay in bed, a heavy darkness overshadowed my thoughts, grappling with the regret of my choices. What was I doing wrong? How could I fix it? Did I care more about my ideals than my son's happiness? I woke with a fragile resolve, deciding to reach out to him, to actually listen. How could I have been so blind? And when I did approach him with that open heart and vulnerability, expecting a bridge to mend, I found him slumped on his bed, scrolling through his phone as if I were a ghost haunting his space. Weeks turned into silent standoffs, but just as I felt the weight of impending loss, I finally caught a break, an unexpected glimpse of hope. One day, out of the blue, Jacob shuffled into the living room. "Sophia's gone," he whispered, dropping those two words like stones that splashed in still water. The heartbreak in his voice cut deep as he spoke of their split, of how her blue hair was now just a childhood memory painted over the walls of his mind. I didn't dare ask why. I didn't dare say anything at all. Instead, we sat in that strange silence, the kind that once filled the void between us but now gave birth to understanding. Maybe I wasn't the complete asshole in this banter of teenage love and rebellion, maybe I was just a parent trying to do the right thing, albeit the wrong way. And as he slowly opened up about his heartache, I realized the layers of my failure, and love, could perpetuate pain. I had a choice, to let this consume me, to drown in expectations of what I thought parenting should entail, or to bare my heart to the truth. I became acutely aware then, that in the fragile world between us, a bridge to hope was forming, the essence of forgiveness that traveled through those hushed moments, guided by the fragility of healing. As we began to talk, not as parent and child, but just two people navigating this chaotic world, I buried any remnants of anger, learned to respect his choices and autonomy, and prayed that this lesson might lead to more than just social media posts or late-night fears. In that moment, I realized that perhaps the greatest act of love is to let go and to learn from the usurping shadows of regret, reminding myself that this delicate dance of love, loss, and redemption was not merely a plot twist in our lives, it was what made us human. The first thing you need to know is that my sister, Jenna, has always been a little different. Not in a bad way, just different. Even as kids, she had her head in the clouds, turning cardboard boxes into spaceships and believing her teddy bears spoke to her at night. I always thought she'd grow out of it, maybe chalk it up to a vivid imagination. But then, Jenna became pregnant. She was over the moon, lining up doll-sized clothes even before she started to show, naming her little one long before the ultrasound could confirm its gender. No one questioned her excitement or her meticulous preparation. After all, impending parenthood does funny things to people. Things took a turn when she started talking about the light. Jenna babbled endlessly about waking up in a glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere, surrounding her belly in a soft, pulsating warmth. She insisted it was a sign that her baby was special, destined for something beyond our mundane comprehension. I dismissed it as new age mumbo-jumbo, the sort that expects you to align crystals to balance chakras. Then she invited me to her home, a small cottage nestled away on the edge of town, claiming she wanted me to meet her miracle. Her intensity almost deterred me, but family obligations won out, and curiosity nudged me forward. The indoors was fouler than I'd imagined, all windows sealed shut, air thick with incense and strange herbs, paintings of celestial phenomena cluttering the walls. Jenna floated about the place like someone possessed, whispering lullabies to her belly, urging it to glow for Auntie. She led me to the nursery where the atmosphere seemed to shift, an odd, oppressive heaviness settling over the room. In the crib, instead of the soft crib cushions and fluffy toys you'd expect, lay a jumbled mass of what looked like wires, slowly undulating as if breathing. It took a moment before I realized, the thing was emitting a ceaseless, soft hum. "Isn't he beautiful?" Jenna beamed with maternal pride, her eyes glazed with something that wasn't entirely sane. My mouth went dry. At first, I thought it was some art project, an elaborate joke, but the reverence in her voice chilled me to the bone. "It's not a real baby," I blurted out, horror gripping me, the moment of clarity ripping through the cocoon of unreality. Instantly, Jenna's face darkened, and her pupils seemed to swallow her irises. She accused me of jealousy, of failing to understand and appreciate the miracle she'd been chosen to carry. Nights became restless for me after that, hours haunted by the drone-like cannulation of circuits and a light that danced beneath my eyelids whenever they slid shut. Something was terribly wrong, clawing at the fringes of my consciousness. I returned, hunting for answers, half believing that I might find a logical explanation. Jenna's welcoming demeanor had soured. I was an outsider, a skeptic, someone trying to put out the light of her child's brilliance. Despite her protests, I inspected her home further, driven by an unseen force, stumbling across drawings that seemed to flicker and pulse, tracing the edges of what looked like machinery-exploded diagrams. My heart pounded erratically. The schematics were disturbingly detailed, suggesting much more than a child's game. Desperately, I sought help from friends and professionals, but they laughed off my concern, dismissing Jenna's obsession as eccentricity and my recounting as someone in need of a little less coffee. Determined, I clandestinely filmed our next interaction, needing evidence, something more than my words could convey. As my phone captured her jubilation, the room grew steadily brighter and my device began to overheat bizarrely, the screen flickering before blacking out entirely. Something in that nursery violated common sense, and being near it filled me with both dread and unnamable awe. "She has plans for us," Jenna kept repeating, rocking on her heels, her hands tracing signals into the fabric of reality I couldn't decipher. The members of an online forum I frequented were the only ones who seemed to take me seriously. They talked of ancient machines, spectral energies, cycles of rebirth, intertwining biology and technology, but it felt so abstract. On a whim, a fellow member offered to connect me with a friend into unraveling the unseen. This contact, when approached, seemed more intrigued than alarmed, offering his expertise for nearly nothing, but making me promise to keep an open mind to the impossible. The day he was to arrive, the sky erupted in a tempest of savage colors, as if some cosmic entity cracked an eye open briefly upon our corner of the world. We entered, he instinctively armed with devices I struggled to understand, and found Jenna cradling the mechanical bundle, as if it were flesh and blood. A single touch from him to the cradle and everything went black, not just the absence of light but a total, enveloping void. In that suffocating darkness, I couldn't tell where I ended and nothingness began. Whispers unlike any sound I'd heard filled the space between heartbeats. The pressure mounted until I thought I might shatter, and then daylight reasserted itself as though nothing had happened. The contraption now lay in dereliction, Jenna sobbing, a hollow ringing resonating through the cottage like a death knell. My contact assured us we'd collapsed a potentiality, a hybrid of intent and incident, one lingering too long between our world and wherever it emanated. Emerging, we found the town caught in a hushed thaw. Many claimed they felt the earth shift, that the skies briefly wept a new kind of rain, one that left them feeling more alive, if not quite whole. Did we save Jenna and her child? The reality replayed in my mind constantly tore at me with unfinished threads, the knowledge that explore dimensions unseen often require a sacrifice not willingly given. Jenna doesn't speak of it, her mind seems to exist in a wrapped state, a tapestry reknitted where holes remain between the stitches. The incidents became folklore, as stories like these often do, but I watched from the periphery as small electrical anomalies began to appear, flocks of birds circling areas devoid of electronic noise, and wondered if something within the cracking tether to our reality had left its echo. Possibly an innocuous whisper long after the scream. Though it's quiet now, I dare not turn my back, refusing to see another glimmer lurking or confront shadows that would dare take form. So, tell me, does that make me the asshole? For trying to save my sister from something she didn't know she invited in, or for telling her cold truth that day? Perhaps the greatest truth is knowing how little we truly understand. I'm not one to post my life's mistakes on social media, but I have to get this off my chest, and I hope someone out there can understand or at least provide me some kind of absolution. About a month ago, life was normal. An average job, an average apartment, and well, an average life. But that all changed when I ran into my old college roommate, Joshua. We hadn't seen each other in years, merely exchanged the obligatory likes and comments on each other's online posts. Anyway, catching up over drinks turned into a constant hangout phase, reminiscing about old times made the mundane seem vibrant again. It was during one of those nights when Josh, visibly edgy and a bit too eager, introduced me to the game. It wasn't like any game I'd ever played before, it didn't have boards or dice, but it started with a plain manila envelope containing an address inside. The rules are simple, Josh said, eyes gleaming, deliver the envelope, and you get your prize. At first, I refused, it sounded like some twisted scavenger hunt, but curiosity and a little alcohol nudged me towards accepting his dare. I thought he was just messing with me. But when I opened the envelope, the address was unsettlingly close to where I lived. That night, with more than a few beers fortifying my courage, I walked over, like some late-night adventurer in my own urban tale. The place was dark, an old dilapidated house that looked like it hadn't seen life in ages. As instructed, I slipped the envelope through the mail slot and seconds later, my phone pinged with a notification of a deposit, $500. It felt surreal, confounding even, and my heart raced with a weird mixture of fear and exhilaration. I told myself it would be a one-time thing. But days passed, and that notification stared back at me, the money somehow whispering promises of easy success. Another week went by, and I became fixated on the contact saved in my phone simply as Game Master. Testing the waters, I messaged them, asking if there were more envelopes to deliver. Within minutes, I received a new address and a promise of a higher reward. Things snowballed from there. I'd drop off a package, always to these abandoned, haunting locations, and watch as my bank balance blossomed. It wasn't until the fourth delivery that something felt truly off. This address was way out in the woods, a place Google Maps struggled to pinpoint. I should have stopped then. Everything screamed at me to walk away, but dizzy from naivete or greed, I didn't listen. I followed the directions into what I was certain was the set of some horror movie, where trees felt like spectators and shadows twisted into memories of nightmares long forgotten. I was instructed to leave the package by a particular tree marked with a red ribbon. Sweat poured down my face in the chilling air, but the job was done quickly, and I returned home, heart still thudding loudly enough to echo in the silence of my sanctuary. But then things began changing. I noticed shadows in my apartment that flickered like wandering ghosts, and objects would be where I hadn't left them, tiny incremental shifts designed to drive anyone mad. At night, when sleep finally claimed me, vivid nightmares plagued my mind, dreams of empty eyes watching me through the slits of abandoned buildings and whispered threats in languages I couldn't understand. Worse, I started seeing someone, or something, out of the corner of my eye, just a tall, dark figure cloaked in obscurity, and every time I turned, it vanished, leaving only traces of an overwhelming dread. Part of me wanted to confront Josh, hear answers from him if I had to, but he disappeared from town without a trace, no phone calls, no status updates, as if he never existed at all. Meanwhile, my paranoia flared into anxiety, and common sounds around me could turn harmless days into haunted nights. Desperate for clarity, I reached out one last time to the game master, begging for an understanding, a reason for these mind-numbing experiences. What I received wasn't a reply, but another envelope under my door, a mirror to my first task but somehow much heavier with an unnameable menace. Inside was a picture, a photograph of my very own apartment building. This time there were no instructions, only a knowing threat sealed with the absence of words. Real fear gripped me then, every facade of self-assurance crumbled, as though life's script was rewritten by some unseen hand. So, I did the only thing I thought might end this, left the city, packed what I could carry and drove across state lines to a place where there are no envelopes, no strange games with rules veiled by darkness. I don't know how far I've driven, or for how long, but with every mile, the bizarre heaviness surrounding me feels diluted. Still, I'm haunted by the feeling that eyes remain fixed, watching, waiting, perhaps even judging. As I pen this, hidden in the imprecision of anonymity, I realize my past decisions unshackled forces that I may never escape. This isn't a confession meant to purge guilt, nor a means to warn others of the unknown lurking in seemingly innocent challenges. Rather, this is a scream into the void, a kaleidoscope of pixels and words, hoping that when you read this, somewhere far beyond where I have traveled, a part of my heavy truth reaches through the reflective glow of your screen, touching the wisdom in your core. If you ever find yourself tempted to play a game without rules, to walk the blurred lines between curiosity and destruction, I urge you to reconsider. My story twists in the churned depths of something old and malevolent. It's a tale which stalks my movements, turning peace into a fractured silence I have come to embody but have yet to fully comprehend. It started when my boss, a stress-fueled gray-haired man named Greg, slapped a dusty folder onto my desk, the label reading Mystery Concert 1989, Town of Ridgewood barely legible beneath a layer of grime, and said, "I need you to find out what happened at this concert." My hesitation was met with a narrowed gaze, and since I needed the paycheck, I dove in, unfurling the brittle pages filled with newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and shaky witness testimonies. From what I gathered, Ridgewood had been a small, sleepy town, until a now obscure band named the Hazy Lights had rolled in for a one-night gig that promised music under the stars, but what unfolded was a chaotic frenzy that reportedly wiped out a third of the population, left more than just missing persons in its wake. At first, it seemed like a simple case of mass hysteria or an unfortunate accident, and despite its historical insignificance, my curiosity grew. I learned that locals had begun to report strange occurrences leading up to the concert, uninvited blackbirds swirling in the skies, children waking in the night screaming about strange sounds coming from the woods, and an ominous feeling that clung to the air like a thick fog. I kept digging, fueled by an insatiable need for answers, my nights consumed by haunting tales of those who fled the scene and those too terrified to speak of it. I found a faded flyer for the concert emblazoned with cryptic symbols that looked like they belonged in an occult dungeon rather than a rock concert, and my heart raced as I discovered a handful of attendees had mysteriously vanished, their names forever etched into the town's unsolved mysteries. As I dug deeper, I spoke with the few surviving townspeople who still dared to remember, their voices trembled, eyes darting as if the shadows around them would come to life at any moment. They told me about the music that night, claiming that it was unlike anything they had ever heard, ethereal and beautiful at first, lulling the crowd into a state of tranquility until it became a cacophony of discordant sounds, piercing through the night and igniting an inexplicable fear that twisted in their stomachs. One elderly woman spoke of her son, who had gone to the concert with friends, only to return in a fugue state, muttering about the glowing stage and the whispers in the trees, his eyes vacant and body trembling as though he bore witness to something otherworldly. He succumbed to nothingness a week later, a shell of the boy she had known, his laughter replaced by a void she had yet to understand. I returned to my desk, unease pooling in my gut, but the deeper I went, the more the stories bled into my reality. I could hear faint echoes of strange melodies whenever I turned off the lights at home, hear whispers that seemed to hang in the air, and I felt watched, as if something from Ridgewood were weaving threads between our worlds. Determined to see this through to the end, I contacted the band, now scattered, living in obscurity, but I managed to track down their lead guitarist, a gaunt man named Ray who spoke in a shuddering whisper, claiming they had been warned by a stranger in a bar about a great power that would be unleashed if they performed the songs they had written. He urged me to leave it alone, they never intended to spark a catastrophe. Each conversation ignited a sense of urgency within me, yet the pieces I collected seemed to spin out of control, like a spiral into madness. A few days later, I visited the concert site, now a patch of overgrown grass and twisted trees, to feel the lingering energy in the air. I walked barefoot through the remaining echoes, the ground cool beneath me, and suddenly, the weight of every story, every terrified witness, crushed down upon me. The air thickened, and I struggled to breathe as shadows writhed around me. Panic clawed at my throat when music, soft at first, began to swell around me, disorienting in its beauty and terrible in its resonance. I stumbled back, the ground shifting as ominous shapes danced at the edge of my vision, and a deafening roar unfurled like an animal awakened from slumber. My thoughts raced as the chorus of phantoms enveloped me, echoing the anguish of those lost and those who wished to forget, my body betraying me as I fought against an unseen force. Yet it yanked me closer to a horrific truth I could barely comprehend. I sprinted back to my car, the sounds still reflecting in my mind, and as I revved my engine, I looked back at the stage's remnants, just as something, a vast, dark figure, shifted among the trees, watching me, causing my skin to prickle with ice. I couldn't shake it. I spent sleepless nights poring over my notes, convinced that one more lead would align the puzzle pieces, and that's when the visions began, flickering glimpses of those who perished, frozen forever in a haze of terror, their mouths twisted in silent screams. The research turned into obsession, the reports of strange happenings in town multiplied, and I finally understood that my pursuit of answers had awakened something deeply buried in Ridgewood, a hungry void that craved more than just souls. One misty evening, determined to confront my fears head-on, I returned to Ridgewood, the chill of the air under the weight of an unseen presence hanging heavy as I navigated the streets now lined with homes abandoned and decaying, yet each felt charged with the echoes of the past. As darkness fell like a cloak, the very atmosphere pulsed around me, drawing me toward what remained of that cursed stage, music swelling once more, irresistible and hypnotic, wrapping its tendrils around my mind as I stepped forward. A shadow slithered past, urging me to join the forgotten concert, where the air grew thicker with a gossamer energy coaxing me forward, and I swear, as I edged closer, I saw their faces materialize, a chorus of the lost, beckoning, promising artistry that transcended fear. It dawned on me, a realization blared like a siren. My research had never been about uncovering the truth, it was about my soul being devoured by a need to hear that sound, feel that energy, to join those who had danced to their own destruction. And in that haunting moment, standing before the remnants of horror, with the deeply rooted chaos swirling around me, I understood, Ridgewood had claimed its next victim, and as the melody surged through my veins, I knew with terrifying clarity that I had come to the end of this narrative, but my story was just beginning. When I entered nursing, I expected long hours, exhaustion, and occasionally ungrateful patients, but what nobody prepared me for was the night my past came clawing back, leaving bloody fingernail marks on the thin veneer of my normal life. A year ago, I was a nurse in the psychiatric unit of a hospital in a town that's more tombstones than people, a place where whispers of the past cling to the air like the persistent fog rolling off the hills at dusk. Our patients ranged from those haunted by shadows in their minds to those dangerously enthralled by the darkness. One such patient was Lester, a middle-aged man with sad eyes and a spine-chilling calmness. Lester was admitted after a series of bizarre incidents in his neighborhood, pets disappearing and strange symbols carved into garden gnomes. He'd often ramble about a glaring unseen and warn anyone who would listen about an impending cosmic reckoning. He was there for months, slipping through different levels of consciousness like a clock gone haywire, sometimes lucid enough for a chess game, other times scrawling frantic, encrypted messages with whatever writing instrument he could find. Then, one stormy night, Lester vanished, just like that, disappearing without so much as a sound or trace. We assumed he slipped out during a power outage, A theory that, albeit convenient, always felt like a thin veil over some hideous truth. For months, my sleep was plagued by dreams of Lester, standing at the foot of my bed, eyes wide and fixed on an unfathomable point behind me, mouthing words I couldn't quite decipher. Despite the hospital's reassurances that Lester was no longer a concern, a flickering candle of paranoia danced at the edges of my mind. Eventually, time did its sneaky trick of laying a fog over past horrors, and I moved to a new city, started at a different hospital, and even managed a sense of peace in the mundane motions of everyday life. That is until last Tuesday, when peace was pulled violently from beneath me. It started with letters. The first few I assumed were junk, plain envelopes with no return address, but the handwriting, jagged and frantic, demanded recognition. Each contained the same cryptic message: the games are not over. The sacrifice is you. Slowly, the overwhelming fear that Lester had found me gripped me in its cold embrace. My heart pounded as the letters increased in fervor and frequency, the content becoming an escalating series of threats and cryptic babbling about cosmic gates and my supposed role in safeguarding something priceless. Anxiety bled into every aspect of my life, shadowing me at work and wrapping its tendrils around each ounce of joy, squeezing it dry. When the letters abruptly stopped about 3 days ago, a foolish hope dared to bloom that it might finally be over. Last night shattered that hope. After an exhausting shift, I sunk into the couch, every muscle pleading for rest, when the sharp trill of my doorbell ripped through my drowsiness. The sight of the unassuming delivery man on my doorstep was my last rational moment. He handed me a package that contained a battered chess piece, the White King, and a note: "Your move." Panic twisted my gut as memories of chess games with Lester flickered back, his intense gaze, how he'd insist the games were more than just games, how he'd leave the king in his pocket like some guardian charm, how the game would only end when the king fell. Adrenaline surged, pushing me to grab a bag and instinctively shove some essentials into it, ready to flee whatever game had begun. But he was already there. Turning from the door, I felt a presence, a static in the air thick enough to taste, and there he stood, Lester, blotting out sameness like a silhouette against blinding light. His eyes held the same sad madness, but now they swirled with something deeper, a knowing beyond our world. "It's time," he uttered softly, the room warping around his voice. I tried to scream but the sound didn't come, choked off by terror twisting its noose around my throat. In a fluid motion, faster and more deliberate than his shuffling form suggested possible, he reached toward me while chanting a string of unfamiliar words. I staggered backward, my mind separating into shards of ice-cold fear, time slowing as if stretching to let the nightmare lengthen. He whispered about journeys through doors unseen by the naked eye, of roles fulfilled and games ending. I felt the tug at my consciousness, a seductive pull to something vast and incomprehensible, but my survival instinct kicked in, a primal roar drowning out his siren call. I grabbed the nearest object, a ceramic vase, and swung with every inch of self-preservation left in me. It shattered against the side of his head, more solid and real than I'd hoped, momentarily stunned. I dashed around him, hearing the shattered pieces crunching under his feet, yelling at my legs to carry me faster than they ever did in any track meet way back in high school. I collapsed into the driver's seat of my car, the engine roared to life, and I drove. I drove until the physical act of it burned into mindlessness, until the lines on the road blurred into a single stream, an escape from whatever cosmic joke I was part of. The radio crackled from the passenger seat, half-functioning, metallic whispers breaking through bursts of static, taunting my certainty of reality. It's been hours, maybe days, since I absconded from my life, staying in motel rooms with flickering neon signs, calling friends to check on my sanity, only to hang up before they answer, unable to admit to anyone the madness unraveling me. Each night, as I lay down with the stolen king piece under my pillow, I hear him, feel his gaze from afar, pleading with me to finish what he started. The things he told me claw at the edges of my sanity, the glaring unseen now something I sense lurking behind each sound and shadow. I'm not sure how much longer I can resist it, or if, maybe, giving in would bring peace to this waking nightmare. If my story ends in a way that makes news, no, it was never just him trying to kidnap me, it was me untethered from a world that lost its grip on reality. Growing up, my grandmother used to warn me about the dangers of whistling at night. "It's an invitation," she'd mutter, her eyes clouded with a fear I never quite understood. An invitation for them. She never specified who they were, but I chalked it up to old wives' tales. Until last week, it had always been just a spooky story to scare children. I'm a night owl by nature, and my job as a freelance writer keeps me up until the early hours. It was a night like any other, cold and silent, save for the occasional creak of my old floorboards under my feet. As I paused to stretch, trying to shake off the persistent chill that seemed to settle on my spine, I began whistling an old tune. I still can't remember why, maybe out of boredom, maybe because the silence felt too heavy. The moment I stopped, an eerie sensation crept over me, one that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness, a sensation of being watched. Trying to dismiss it, I went back to my computer, focusing on the glow of the screen, convincing myself that the stories my grandmother told me were just figments of her overactive imagination. However, as the clock ticked towards 3 a.m., a time when the world feels both too real and unreal at once, I felt it again, stronger this time. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, my instincts screaming that I wasn't alone in my cozy little apartment. The feeling wasn't just ominous, it was oppressive, like a weight settling heavily on my chest. I forced myself to peer through the blinds, into the darkened street below, bathed in the eerie glow of streetlights. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, the world was as still and quiet as ever. But as I started pulling away, a subtle movement in the shadow of a large oak tree caught my eye. My heart skipped a beat. It was so faint, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Squinting into the darkness, I could just barely make out a silhouette that seemed out of place, too tall, too thin, its shape flickering as if it were fighting to stay within this realm. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as the figure seemed to shimmer with a disturbing elegance, like the air around it was bending or tearing. Logic reminded me that shadows can be tricky at this hour, but intuition, the primal part buried deep inside, screamed that this was the consequence warned about, that I had, indeed, extended an invitation with my thoughtless whistling. I rushed to shut the blinds, my heart pounding so loudly I feared it could wake the neighbors. Sleep was impossible. I sat up the rest of the night, wide-eyed and alert, every creak of the wooden boards below or sigh of the wind through the trees setting my nerves blazing. Morning light brought the illusion of safety, and as banal daily life took over, I could almost convince myself it was a dream, my imagination fueled by fatigue and perhaps a touch too much late-night coffee. Nonetheless, unease lurked at the back of my mind, it niggled at me throughout the day, refusing to let go. By nightfall, I ensured the curtains were tightly drawn before dusk settled. But when silence descended, the specter of my past transgression loomed larger, overshadowing any sense of peace. Urged by a mix of dread and curiosity, I attempted to busy myself with chores. As I moved through my apartment, though, the feeling that unfriendly eyes were upon me grew stronger with each passing hour, often throwing glances over my shoulder at imagined movements in the corners of my vision. It was as if I was being studied, weighed, and measured by unseen presence or presences. My grandmother's words, which I'd considered nothing more than folklore, twisted into chains of anxiety around my stomach. In the days that followed, small things began to happen, escalating my unease into outright terror. Each morning, I'd find the curtains in my living room drawn open, as if someone, or something, wanted to gaze inside, to confirm its interest. Objects around the apartment would move from their usual spots, subtle enough to question my sanity yet brazen enough to kindle fear. I started hearing low whistling outside my windows at odd hours, a lilting melody that was both beautiful and menacing in its simplicity, echoing just faintly yet clearly enough to cut through the night's silence. The last straw came on a night when I decided to ignore the sound, lying in bed with a pillow over my head, when my phone buzzed fiercely on my bedside table. It was an unknown number, and though every rational part of my mind urged me not to pick up, the trembling part of me needed to know. Hesitantly, I answered, and the low whistle spilled into my ear like poison, the exact tune I had whistled days ago, perfected and chilling. I disconnected the call with shaky hands, only for it to ring again. Moments later, I threw the phone into the bottom drawer of my closet, muffling the sound, but the tune still echoed in my mind. That night, I barely slept, fear too palpable to allow me even a moment's respite. I knew I was past the point of no return. Somewhere out there, I had beckoned a watcher, and it had accepted my summons. In desperation, I visited my grandmother, seeking the wisdom I had so easily dismissed. Her eyes tightened when I told her what happened, and her lips pressed into a grim line. She reached for an old leather-bound book, one that felt heavy with an age-old knowledge even before she cracked it open. Inside, written in faded ink, were symbols and tales far too ancient and daunting for a casual reader. She spoke of rituals, ways to appease those whose attention I had unwittingly captured. They are drawn to sound, to rhythm. You must give them a song with no ending. A tune that loops back onto itself, without a beginning or end, until it lulls them away, she advised, urgency creasing her features. Armed with this strange knowledge, I went back home, unsure yet determined. As twilight crept through the cracks and porch lights flickered on like guardians of the mundane, I sat with my old guitar, tuning its strings carefully. I played and played, almost trance-like, weaving melodies that blended and twisted into each other seamlessly. Hours merged as I soldiered on, fingers raw and heart pounding. At times, I felt eyes on me, soft, almost gentle in comparison to the earlier oppressive scrutiny. I didn't stop, not until the sky began bruising with dawn and the melody finally sunk into a rhythmic murmur forgotten by the night. Exhaustion claimed me, yet, for the first time in days, I managed sleep. When I awoke, clarity and a sense of calm descended upon the apartment, as if whatever was watching me had let go. The shadows no longer seemed to bear weight. The objects remained in place, the curtain stayed drawn. It was over, or so I hoped. I never whistled at night again, and neither should you, for there are watchers in the midnight shadows, and sometimes an invitation doesn't take words at all. When I was 13, I learned a heartbreaking truth about family. The ones you love often come loaded with the kind of baggage that can crush you before you even have the chance to pack your own. My dad had run off with this woman who I had never met, and suddenly, life flipped upside down. My mom was a mess, struggling to keep everything together while working 2 jobs, and every time I saw her after school, she'd smile but it never reached her eyes. So, when my dad introduced me to Karen, I tried to convince myself it might be okay, maybe she'd be a nice stepmother, someone to lighten mom's burden. But after a month of fake smiles and her passive-aggressive comments about how I should respect her, I came to learn Karen wasn't just strict, she was relentless. The first time she openly criticized my mom was at the dinner table, her fork clinking against her plate as she scoffed at my choice to wear the one sweater my mom had stitched together, the sleeves a little too long and the fabric a little too worn. "If your mother really cared, she wouldn't let you walk around like that," she said, pushing my father to agree, and I could feel my heart shatter under the weight of his silence. It became routine for her to bash my mom, how she wasn't there for me, how she couldn't provide, how I could be so much more if only I lived with her and my dad. I endured it for months, swirling inside myself like a cyclone of angst and resentment until one fateful evening, when she crossed a line about my mom's intelligence, branding her as bereft of common sense, I snapped. I told her that if she didn't stop, I would pack my things and live full-time with my mom. I meant it, even if my voice trembled. The room fell silent, and for a moment I thought maybe Dad would back me up, maybe he'd remember the mother who raised me with love like a warm cocoon. But instead, his face turned stone cold, and Karen's eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, lit up like she'd just found a new prey. "You think you can just threaten me? You think you can weaponize your mother against me?" She sneered, and I felt a chill stab through me. That night, things shifted. Karen made it her mission to make my life hell. Suddenly, there were rules everywhere. No dinner until your homework is done, no snacks before your chores, and I don't want to hear from your mother. It was like living under a tyrant, and it escalated to an almost unbearable degree. Karen called my mom on a Tuesday evening while I was supposed to be studying. I heard the heated exchange from the other room. Words were barked, accusations hurled about my lack of discipline, about how I almost failed my last term out of neglect for responsibility. Mom's voice shook when she replied, but I felt her conviction cutting through the tension. That cracked door was my only window into what was happening, and I couldn't help but eavesdrop as Karen ended the call with a sickening, "Feel free to take her back anytime." I found myself standing on the edge of a precipice, my heart hammering at the prospect that my mom could be my refuge again. But every thought that flickered in my mind was doused by the aching doubt of a child trapped in a war between parents. When I finally gathered the nerve to talk to my dad, his response was as disappointing as ever. He dismissed my concerns like wielding a fly swatter in the middle of hurricane winds, telling me it was all in my head and I simply needed to shape up. Days turned into weeks, and the heavy atmosphere around the house turned toxic, like breathing in smoke from a raging fire, putrid and choking. I tried talking to my friends, but they didn't understand. They couldn't grasp the mind games Karen played, nor the emotional turmoil that electrified the hairs on the back of my neck. I felt isolated, imprisoned by my choices, until I finally reached a breaking point the night before a family outing for Dad's birthday. I overheard Karen call my mother a failed experiment and it boiled something deep within me. I stormed into the kitchen, adrenaline pumping, my voice a mix of fury and fear as I declared I'd rather live with a failed experiment than a monster. For the first time, I saw fear flutter in her eyes, but it quickly morphed into rage. She lunged at me, grabbing the edge of the table as if it were a life raft and spat words meant to cut me, words she hoped would deliver the ultimate blow. "You will never escape. You're part of this family now, And if your mother really wanted you, she wouldn't have let your father go. The air crackled with electricity, and I realized I was too far gone to turn back. I was ready to break this cycle. I couldn't be held hostage anymore. I told my dad in the cold silence that followed that I was serious, that I meant every word about moving in with my mom if he didn't act. I could feel the ground shifting beneath us, a storm brewed in the expectations of loyalty, love, and the fractured reality of our lives. Dad's expression darkened. I could see his internal struggle, yet he found no words to defend my choice, sealing my fate. The next morning, I packed a small duffel and waited by the door while Karen hollered about my defiance like a wolf cornering its prey. But it did nothing to my resolve. When Dad finally left for work, the decision came to fruition. I texted my mom, hoping she'd meet me halfway. As I trudged to the car, filling with dread, I stole a glance back at the house, the place that had turned into my prison. I could only hope my choice wouldn't haunt me forever, but the thrill of freedom coursed through my veins. But Karen's laughter echoed behind me, the howl of a wolf who'd just been dealt a bitter blow and wasn't about to give up the chase. And now, as I sit here writing this, on the edge of my new life yet trapped in a chilling void of uncertainty, I can feel her shadow looming over me. Every flicker of doubt shakes me to the core. Was I really free, or just a pawn traded in a game I didn't understand? All I know is this: I will not go quietly, and I brace myself for the inevitable storm I've unleashed. When the opportunity arose, I never imagined that joining the experimental project at the obscure Quantum Research Division would catapult me into an era where humanity didn't exist. It started with a cryptic Craigslist ad, promising adventure beyond the imagination. Anything to escape my soul-deadening office job seemed worth the gamble. Little did I know that within weeks, I'd be the first test subject hurled back 66 million years to the Cretaceous period, standing bewildered and breathless in a world untainted by human hands. The first thing that struck me was the raw, untamed beauty of it all, the air so pure it almost hurt to breathe, the sky painted in shades I'd never seen in any dawn. But beauty quickly morphed into terror, as the guttural roar of a far-off carnivore reminded me how precarious my intrusion here was. Initially, the excitement overshadowed the danger until I felt the ground shake with each step of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. My heart threatened to escape my chest as I hid behind massive ferns, watching the beast tear through the underbrush in pursuit of unsuspecting prey. Days blurred into nights, a constant battle for survival, using the scant knowledge I had about the prehistoric world, eating berries that didn't poison me and sheltering beneath thick fronds or inside hollow logs like some primitive creature of yore. Communication with the lab was meant to be seamless, the sleek wristband they gave me supposed to keep data flowing back and forth. Yet, as the days turned jaggedly into a surreal nightmare, the creeping dread of absolute isolation set in. The device, which I initially dismissed as a glorified GPS, lay mute, leaving me alone in this ancient land far from home. Desperation leads one to peculiar acts. With tiny rations depleting rapidly, I stumbled upon a nest of eggs. They seemed a delicious godsend, but the sight of their mother, a territorial triceratops, made me reconsider my theft. Man versus beast in its rawest form, my superior intellectual faculties felt dwarfed by their sheer power and instinct. Every rustle in the foliage, every whisper of the wind, was pregnant with lurking threats. Strange things happened as the days stretched on. Odd weather patterns, eerie sounds at night, grating growls both foreign and terrifying, suspense hung heavy in the damp, heavy air. Dreams warped into nightmares where familiar faces gazed unblinkingly with prehistoric eyes. I began doubting whether time itself ran differently here. Perhaps eternity was descending, unspooling not in moments but in eons. One evening, amidst this primordial chaos, as a blood-red sunset bathed the landscape in an otherworldly glow, those dreams sharpened into something more terrifying. I found myself watching a spectral figure moving with surreal purpose through the open terrain. It didn't belong in this Cretaceous tableau, dressed in modern attire, a shimmering distortion as if a mirage. The figure, almost recognizably human, seemed to beckon, its eyes, twin voids of emptiness. I could no longer distinguish delusion from reality, loneliness gnawed at my sanity. Then, as abruptly as it began, the experiment ended, a flash of searing white light, a feeling of weightlessness followed by the jolt of my body crashing back into existence like a shipwrecked survivor breaching the surface after endless moments beneath the waves. I awoke on a stretcher, surrounded by white coats and sterile comforts, their voices a cacophony of relief and concern. Despite assurances that I was back, with my body intact, if significantly weathered by ordeal, my mind remained adrift somewhere vast and ancient. I didn't return alone. Not physically, there was no parasitic alien hitchhiker, no biosafety hazard. It was a shadow only I could perceive, lurking just out of sight, casting doubts, whispering in voices both sinister and familiar. The world had shifted during my absence, or maybe I had. My suburbia felt subtly wrong, a cosmic joke at my understanding of reality. The night was no longer a companion but a canvas of dread, sounds of distant, unknown creatures carried by the wind, and reflections in mirrors and still water gesturing towards something I couldn't bear to acknowledge. An internal tremor has taken root, a perpetual dissonance between here and there, now and then. To the world, I'm a survivor of a failed temporal voyage. To myself, I am forever a chimera, one foot snagged in history's deepest well. I realize now that time was more than the simple linear path we perceive. It was fluid, boundless, and I, in less optimistic moments, sometimes fear I never truly escaped. Each cycle of the moon feels less like the passage of days and more like the insidious countdown to another unintended departure, and with each glance at my reflection, I half expect to see those void-like eyes staring back, a visitor who will never leave. The house on Memory Lane had always been a source of hushed whispers and cautious glances in my hometown. It stood at the end of a curving road, cloaked in a relentless mist that seemed to roll off the nearby river, and yet, I never really believed the stories about it until that fateful night 2 weeks after my grandmother's funeral. I had just turned 16 and was desperate for an escape from the suffocating grief, the well-meaning relatives, and their pitiful condolences. It was a Saturday and the air was thick with an unseasonable chill as I made my way to Memory Lane, my heart beating in rhythm with the echo of distant laughter from the party I had been too glum to attend. The house, a once vibrant Victorian now cloaked in vines and neglect, seemed alive under the pale moonlight, shadows twisting around its broken shutters like desperate fingers clawing for a way out. Ignoring the strange sense of weight in the air, I stepped onto the creaky porch, inhaling the stale scent of damp wood and decay that lingered in the oppressive silence. With a trembling hand, I turned the tarnished doorknob, and the door swung open with a reluctant groan, revealing a vast darkness that swallowed the light behind me. As I ventured in, nostalgia twisted at my heart with every creak of the floorboards underfoot, the house seemingly alive with memories I never knew I had. Old photographs hung crookedly on the walls, faces of people caught in laughter, their eyes shimmering with life. They felt like family, and the realization hit me hard. These were my relatives, those who had disappeared from my life long before my birth, buried by time and by secrets I had yet to uncover. The living room felt strangely warm, comforting, as if it had been prepared just for me. There was a dusty armchair that looked like my grandmother used to sit in, its fabric worn but familiar, and in that moment, I felt an inexplicable pull to stay a while. I sank into it, and the moment I did, something shifted in the room, a sensation, almost like a breath, swirled around me, thickening the air, and the photographs began to shift before my eyes, the people in them moving, their mouths forming silent words. I could see them clearer now, the stories etched in their features, and I realized I wasn't just looking at pictures, I was glimpsing shards of my family's past, and I felt the longing swell inside me as they reached for me through time. Suddenly, the air grew heavier, the shadows lengthened, and the whimsical whispers morphed into fevered cries, shadows merging and bubbling like a storm drawing near. I panicked and stumbled back, but the room contorted, objects floated before me, twisted around like a vortex leading deeper into the inexplicable void of the house. It felt wrong, so wrong, but I couldn't tear myself away. I was anchored in place, pulled deeper into my family's tangled history. Then the walls began to flicker, oscillating between past and present until I was face to face with a woman who looked just like my grandmother. Her eyes were the same piercing blue, but there was an edge to her smile, a darkness that revealed more than it concealed. "You've come to remember," she said, her voice drenched in warmth and sorrow, echoing as it twisted around me, something so alluring and terrifying that it invited me closer, urging me to step into her world. "You must learn why we can't leave." My breath quickened, part of me clung to her revelations, while another part recoiled in horror. I was trapped in this collapsing reality, unable to break her gaze as she began to unravel tales of the family I had never known, the laughter, the fights, the betrayals woven into this house, the churning of memories and whispers of forgotten secrets that flowed like waves. With every story, I felt the weight of my own grief peeling away, replaced with something sinister, something hungry. I understood now why this house had held on to its memories so fiercely. It was all pain and regret, connected so deeply to my own life that I almost felt honored and cursed to bear them. Just as I began to grasp what was happening, an unspeakable darkness unfurled itself behind her, a living shadow seething with malice, and its eyes, countless and hollow, focused on me. "You linger," it hissed, a cacophony of voices ringing in my ears, You haven't established where you belong. Panic surged through me like adrenaline, breaking the enchantment she had spun around me as I stumbled back, grabbing at anything to anchor me in the chaos, only to find my reflection in an old, cracked mirror. The familiar face staring back at me was twisted and wrong, a grotesque parody of my existence. In that moment, I understood that the house fed off my essence, on the memories I was too afraid to confront, haunting me with pieces of untold stories linking my life to their suffering, promising something that felt like recognition, and yet tasted like betrayal. With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned to flee, but the shadows twisted around me, blocking my path, consuming the light until I was left in a suffocating shroud of darkness. "You cannot forget," my grandmother's voice echoed, now laced with anger, "because there is no escape." Ultimately, I broke free, a surge of adrenaline propelling me up the stairs as the house trembled, its walls closing in, each step echoing with anguished cries from the photographs that now felt more alive than ever before. The floorboards splintered beneath me, the memories clawing at my heels until I burst through the door, racing into the night, stumbling down the porch steps to freedom. I didn't stop running until I reached the river, gasping for breath, the mist curling around me, whispering secrets I dared not listen to. I looked back at the towering nightmare that had once been home to comforting faces, the lights flickering like dying stars. The house was empty now, echoing only with the remnants of what I had stolen. They had been waiting for me, for my return, but my heart pounded with a warning. I knew I could never return to memory lane again, and though I had escaped, I would carry this burden for the rest of my life, knowing that just beyond the edge of my memory lay a door always waiting to be opened, a house forever hungry for the stories it had lost, patiently waiting for another to cross its threshold. Last summer, I had the kind of summer your kids dream of, long, lazy days filled with sun and laughter, but everything changed one chilly evening when I discovered my son Lucas's secret. It all started when he turned 14 and, like any rebellious teenager, began pushing boundaries and testing limits. I tried my best to trust him as he started hanging out with friends from school, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, especially since 2 weeks ago when he came home late smelling like chlorine and leaves, claiming he was just at the mall. But the whispers I heard through the neighborhood grapevine painted a different story. I learned that a group of kids from their school had been gathering at the creek behind my house for a swim, and only a few were brave enough to go completely nude, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my son was one of them. So one fateful evening as the sun began to set, casting an eerie glow over the trees, I decided to follow him, my heart pounding with anxiety and disappointment. I hid behind a cluster of bushes and watched as Lucas, along with his friends, shrieked with laughter and splashed water under the crescent moonlight. I felt a mix of anger and sadness wash over me as I watched him shed his clothes like a child shedding innocence, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. The freedoms of youth clashed with my parental fears, and I felt an overwhelming urge to intervene. Watching him laugh uninhibitedly, I wrestled with the decision: should I confront them then and there, or let him learn from his mistakes in what I believed to be a harmless moment of teenage rebellion? But then I spotted the oldest kid there, Jake, whispering something into Lucas's ear before they all disappeared below the water's surface. I could feel my heart racing as I got a glimpse of my son's carefree smile and the look of admiration in his eyes. What that kid said must have been reckless, and that revelation drove the point home: I couldn't let this go. When I finally confronted them, the surprise on their faces was palpable. I recalled every moment, the rush of adrenaline, the shame mixing with fear in Lucas's eyes as he scrambled to grab his clothes. The confrontation unfolded in a mixture of embarrassment and anger, and it all came pouring out. I yelled, told them that they were too young to be doing things like this and that I expected better from my son. But even as my voice rose in that moment, I could hear the words of a parent who feared losing their grip on a child becoming an adult too fast. Once we returned home, I demanded that Lucas sit down, and the disappointment I felt twisted into something deeper, a longing to keep him innocent, a fear of what that moment could signify for his future. I felt justified in grounding him for 2 weeks. At the time, I thought it was fair. He needed to understand that actions have consequences, that there's a line that shouldn't be crossed. Yet, as I locked the door to his room that night, I saw him slumped against his bed, staring blankly at the wall with tears slowly spilling from his eyes, and I questioned if I had truly done the right thing. Days passed, and I found myself replaying that night over and over, my mind a battleground. My friends empathized. They'd say grounding him was the right call. We live in a different world now, where social media could turn mistakes into permanent scars. But the eye rolling from my son every time I tried to approach him began to chip away at my conviction, and I realized that just as I feared I'd lost him, he was slowly losing trust in me, too. Finally, in an attempt to understand his perspective, I sat down with Lucas to talk. His face stiffened and uneasy at first, but once he opened up, I was taken down a path I hadn't anticipated. To him, skinny dipping was an innocent memento of friendship and youth, a means to explore a small part of life outside the confines of school and homework. His voice trembled as he asked me why I couldn't just see that. I watched regret fill his eyes as he described the thrill and laughter that came with their secret traditions. I felt my defenses crumble, and I began to see the world through his eyes. For a moment, I found myself lost in the nostalgia of my own childhood, the mischief of sneaking out with friends and the feeling of unrestrained freedom. Yet, that night still echoed in my mind, and fear consumed me more than understanding ever could. I had wanted to shield him from pain. Instead, I was hurting him. The realization sank in that grounding him may have pushed him farther away from me, elicited more rebellion. Before he left, Lucas leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm not a kid anymore." I watched him walk away, and my heart dropped. I spent the next few nights tossing and turning, reflecting on what "am I the asshole" truly meant in this context. Since I'd always held a strong belief in protecting my son, I had to wonder if perhaps my own fears of losing him were guiding my actions more than love or reason. The weeks went by and Lucas's zest for life dimmed, and by the time his grounding was officially over, it felt as if our bond had unraveled so much that the mere act of letting him go seemed monumental. I feared what adventures and impulses lay ahead for him when he finally left the house. I decided I needed to apologize. I had to admit I was wrong. Gathering what remained of my courage, that evening, under the golden light pouring through his window, I knocked softly on his door, my heart racing with every potential outcome. He opened it reluctantly, and I awkwardly stumbled over my words. But as I expressed my regrets and fears, I noticed a flicker of relief cross his face. It turned into a long conversation that felt like the bridge we were building back to each other, but I realized it would take more than one moment to heal the rift. The following weeks unfolded slowly as we rebuilt our relationship, one awkward conversation at a time and shared laughter over silly YouTube videos, yet each time I watched him slip out the door with friends, a knot grew in my stomach. On one of those evenings, I caught the news. A local story about two kids who drowned in that very creek played across the television, and I remember my breath catching as the image of their faces glared at me through the screen, kids who were just having fun on an innocent day. My heart raced with anxiety as I confronted my worst fears. Had I made his friendship more dangerous by grounding him? In the weeks that followed, I found myself grappling with anxiety-driven fantasies, imagining every horrifying scenario. I could do nothing but sit there with the weight of knowing how fragile life truly is. I suddenly realized that while I still feared my son was growing up too fast, I was perhaps more afraid of holding him back. How easy it was to slip into old habits and create a distance where misunderstanding lived. Perhaps nakedness in the moonlight could be innocent, just like childhood mysteries. So, I made a decision. I let him go on the next outing with a renewed sense of trust, understanding and frustration, excitement and worry all mixed together. When he walked out, I felt light for the first time in weeks, knowing that despite my fears, I had to trust him, and that was the moment I became a different kind of parent, one who was learning that love sometimes needed to take a leap of faith. I've never felt the need to share this until now, but seeing how things have spiraled for some young people out there, I believe my confession can serve as a warning, especially for those stepping into the shoes of responsibility that come with looking after siblings. My name is irrelevant. You can call me an elder sister, as that's the role I grew into far too young. I suppose this all started on a mundane autumn evening when the sky was thick with clouds, and the wind howled like a pack of wolves on the hunt. My parents had left me in charge of my little brother, Sam, who was only 6 at the time. They went to visit my aunt who suddenly fell ill, leaving me with strict instructions: under no circumstances were we to leave the house. Quite simple, right? But there's nothing simple about being home alone with a child who has an affinity for adventures. At first, everything went as expected. Cartoon channels and chocolate chip cookies kept him busy while I basked in the electric glow of my phone, scrolling through trivial memes. Things began to change when the power flickered and died, plunging us into an abyss of blackness. I tried to stay calm, fetching the flashlight my dad kept in the closet. Sam was restless, clinging to my leg, his small face scrunched up in fear. I don't know what possessed me to entertain his wishes, but when he insisted we play hide and seek, I acquiesced, thinking it was a game that would put his mind at ease, and perhaps my own. I counted to 20 as I heard his small footsteps padding away into the echoing rooms of our 2-story house. I should have considered the creaks and groans that the house emitted, sounds that seemed to resonate from its very bones. Frankly, I don't know how long I spent searching each familiar space that suddenly felt foreign in the dark. There was a pervasive silence, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. Opening the closet, checking behind curtains, under beds, he was nowhere to be found. A cold stab of anxiety set in as I navigated the dim hallways, calling out his name, my voice barely masking the brewing panic. All the while, I couldn't shake the peculiar sensation that we weren't alone, that there was a presence, a shadow, lurking just beyond my periphery. In the end, this sensation led me to the attic, a dusty, forgotten place where light barely fought its way through the grime-smeared windows. There, in the corner, was Sam, huddled and whispering to someone, or something, that I could not see. I wanted to believe it was just a child's imagination, until he turned, and his eyes weren't his own. They were deeper, darker, unfathomably so, like staring into the void. Before I could react, he spoke in a voice that certainly wasn't that of a 6-year-old. It was guttural, ancient, a language beyond comprehension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on edge. I managed to drag him away, his body cold and limp as though he were in a trance. The flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the wooden attic beams, and for a moment, I swear I saw another form lingering there, watching, almost smirking at my feeble attempt to reclaim my brother. We stumbled and half fell down the stairs, the image permanently etched into my mind. Sam regained consciousness, or whatever semblance of it you can call, yet he was changed somehow. He didn't remember the attic or who he had spoken to. There was a blankness, a vacancy, as if something had been taken from him. The power returned with a buzz, slowly bringing life back to the house, but that evening dimmed something in us both, a hard-to-describe shadow of its own. Even after my parents came back, bustling with apologies for leaving us alone with no backup generator, I couldn't shake the aura of dread that lingered far too long after they were asleep. Sam seemed normal again, if not a little quieter than usual, yet sometimes I would catch him staring at shadows as if they whispered secrets meant only for him. Now my confession, I never told my parents. Maybe it was because I couldn't bear the disbelief or the possibility of ridicule, but perhaps because I feared that acknowledging it would make it real, too real. Sometimes I feel it was a cowardly choice, yet my burden to bear. I grew up, as siblings do, yet the watchful feeling never left me. As Sam became a teenager, the shadow clung to him like a second skin. He withdrew from friends, spent hours alone in his room with simply the company of whispers, though I never had the courage to ask whom he conversed with. Writing this, I wish I could say it was all behind us, that the ominous feeling evaporated with the cracking of dawn like morning mist. But I suspect that whatever it was, it still watches. I've seen its faint reflection in mirrors, the flicker in unattended corners of the room. My advice to anyone in my shoes? Always be vigilant. One moment of distraction in the vast silence of an empty house might seem innocent enough, but you could be opening a door to something that you can neither comprehend nor confront. Now, under the glow of the solitary lamp, as I hear shuffling in the attic above, like the whisper of the past calling, I wonder if maybe I need to confess to someone who could truly understand the gravity. But for now, these words are for you, dear reader, as the night stretches on. Would telling someone else lift this weight? Or would it only manifest it into something waiting, poised on the edge of your shadow, to follow you, wherever you may hide? For over 2 decades now, I've carried pumpkin seeds in my pocket, scattering them across every place I've visited. It became a ritual, beginning from a whimsical thought and spiraling into something far more sinister than I could have ever anticipated. It started innocently enough. I remember my grandmother's garden filled with the vibrant, sprawling vines of pumpkins that transformed her backyard into a living fairy tale. The simple act of sowing life from such an unassuming seed entranced me as a child. It felt like magic, seeing the small orange globes grow into massive, glowing entities beneath the leafy canopy she lovingly tended. After she passed, I found solace in planting seeds wherever I wandered. It was my way of keeping her spirit alive, nurturing the same enchantment I once felt in her garden. Every pocketful of seeds carried hope and remembrance, and I naively believed in their harmless whimsy until strange things started to happen. At first, I didn't connect the dots. The vines would appear in odd places, threading through sidewalk cracks in cities, creeping across suburban lawns, and climbing up trees in parks. But then the reports began. Neighbors spoke of strange occurrences near these pumpkins, whispering tales of shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, of ground that felt alive, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath them. A sense of unease settled over the places I'd been, and people began to avoid those areas, sensing something was amiss but unable to articulate it. I, too, started noticing peculiarities. Pumpkins that grew seemingly overnight into enormous, Twisted shapes, far beyond normal autumnal bounty. Faces seemed to form in their ridged surfaces, grinning and leering in the darkness. Birds would not perch near them, their songs absent in their presence. One night, while traveling through a remote stretch of woods, I heard a rustling. My flashlight caught glimpses of hulking shadows shifting among the trees. The pumpkins there had grown immense, their vines thick as my arm, pulsing faintly with an unsettling life. Hidden within the shadows were forms that seemed to torn from nightmares, distorted figures that never fully emerged from the shade, watching me with an intelligence that was deeply, instinctively wrong. I fled, seeds spilling from my pockets as I ran, trying desperately to escape a horror I had unwittingly propagated. Over time, the connection became undeniable. The more seeds I planted, the stranger the manifestations grew. The vines almost seemed conscious, stretching towards people, their tendrils curling like fingers. An oppressive weight filled the air near the pumpkins, a palpable malevolence that chilled even the warmest summer breeze. My dreams were invaded by grotesque visions of the pumpkins opening, revealing cavernous mouths filled with seeds in place of teeth, whispering secrets I could never remember upon waking. Attempts to eradicate the plants were futile, every vine cut down seemed to return. Thrice as vigorous, as though offended by the resistance. Soil grew barren where the vines were pulled, refusing to nurture anything else, and any new seeds dispersed grew more sinister than their predecessors. Only one person, an elderly herbalist living on the edge of one such haunted plot, offered any plausible explanation. She claimed the seeds bore not just life, but part of me, my essence, my emotions, and maybe something darker. Every plant that sprouted carried a shadow of my grief, my anger, my moments of despair, traits that festered and mutated into what had been unleashed. Returning home, I tried burning the seeds, thinking perhaps I could sever the connection before it grew further out of control. But the flames fed the seeds, rather than consuming them, and the smoke that rose whispered my grandmother's name. I now scour every filed report of bizarre vegetation sightings, hoping to trace the cursed vine's proliferation back to their source, hoping that somewhere amidst the chaos lies a secret to undo what I've set in motion. But even as I search, I realize the seeds have scattered too far, taking on lives of their own. Wherever I walk, the earth chills, awaiting the next cycle, sensing the burden of the destiny I've seeded across the world. Whispers follow me now, weaving through the breeze, asking questions I dread to answer. As twilight descends, I feel the weight in my pocket, seeds that seem to hum with intent, uncomfortably warm against my skin, like the last breath of a lingering, unseen presence reminding me of the unknown legacy I'm growing, and possibly the end I might reap from it all. When I first insisted my mom stay with me postpartum instead of rushing off to see my sister-in-law who was also due soon, it seemed like a logical request. My mother, known for her doting nature, was torn between her duties. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Our family was close, and the idea of hosting 2 newborns and 2 recovering mothers simultaneously was already a challenge. My husband, Ryan, supported the idea. After all, after years of barely seeing Mom due to her devotion to my brother, it was about time I had a chance to bond with her, especially at such a crucial moment in my life. But I had no idea how twisted things would become. Mom reluctantly agreed, and when my due date came, she was there, clutching her overnight bag and a sense of unease that only I seemed to notice. My sister-in-law, Jenna, was due a week after me, but my brother lived several states away, making simultaneous support impossible. I selfishly thought, just this once, let me have Mom to myself. The birth was a blur of beeping monitors and sterile smells at the hospital. Once I was finally holding my daughter, Aurora, in my arms, there was a peace that settled over me. Little did I know it was the last peace I'd feel for some time. Mom was a comforting presence at first, organizing meals, holding Aurora while I stumbled through the exhausting cycle of sleep and feeding. But at night, strange things began to happen. The first incident occurred 3 days after we brought Aurora home. I awoke to the feeling of someone watching me. In the dim light, I could see a figure standing in the corner of our bedroom. My heart pounded until I realized it was just Mom, staring at us from the shadows. "Mom?" I whispered, groggy and confused. She didn't respond immediately, but eventually, she turned and walked away without another word. The next morning, I questioned her about it over breakfast. I must have been sleepwalking. She laughed it off, yet a strand of unease lingered. That day, I caught her humming a lullaby I didn't recognize. It wasn't strange for her to hum, but something about the tune chilled me to the bone. Aurora, usually an angel, began crying in fits unlike her usual hunger cries. They were sharp, almost as if she was in pain. I attributed it to colic until Ryan came home early one evening and stopped dead in his tracks, listening. "What's that song?" he asked warily. Mom froze, her smile abruptly vanishing. "Just a nursery rhyme from my childhood," she answered, but Ryan, unnerved like I was, insisted he'd never heard any song like that before. The nights continued to darken. I found myself staying up longer, despite my exhaustion, just to watch over Aurora. One night, footsteps echoed down the hall, and I was drawn to the sound like a moth to a flame. I peeked out and saw Mom at Aurora's door, whispering something softly as her fingers traced the air above my daughter's crib. When she turned and saw me, her hand jerked back. "She's just so beautiful," Mom whispered breathlessly, her eyes wide and unblinking in the dim light. Something was off, and Ryan felt it too. We agreed to install a baby monitor with a camera, just to see if we could catch what was going on. What we saw the following night, though, made my blood run cold. Around 3 a.m., the feed showed Mom entering Aurora's room. She leaned over the crib, humming that creepy lullaby again, but this time, the air seemed to shimmer. As she hummed, Aurora seemed to settle, her cries abruptly cutting off, replaced by an eerie silence. But then, something unexplainable happened. Aurora began levitating a few inches above her mattress, her tiny body floating as Mom continued her song. I showed Ryan the footage immediately, and we both confronted Mom the next morning. Her reaction was unlike anything I expected. She burst into tears, pleading with us to let her continue. "It's for Aurora's own good," she claimed, but her explanations were jumbled, hysterical. To protect her from Jenna's baby, she finally confessed in a whisper. My heart dropped, the room seeming to spin. "Jenna?" I echoed, not understanding. Mom revealed that in our family, there had always been a second purpose to the lullaby, an ancient rite passed down to safeguard one child above another, but only one. I was incredulous. How could she choose one grandchild's well-being over the other? Realizing Ryan and I were resolute in stopping her rituals, Mom became frantic. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," she shouted, her voice filled with a terror that made my skin crawl. It was as if she truly believed Jenna's unborn child posed an unimaginable threat. We sent Mom away, feeling haunted by her warnings, hoping things would revert to normal. But they didn't. Aurora's cries intensified, often hallucinating bursts of the lullaby floating through the air. We began hearing things, seeing flickers of movement in the corners of our eyes. I swear there were whispers in that strange language woven into the lullaby, words I didn't know yet had terrible weight. Ryan stayed up late with me, clutching Aurora, who began sprouting ominous bruises and scratches that no pediatrician could explain. One afternoon, my brother called, his voice tinged with despair. Jenna had gone into labor but something was wrong, it was too early, the baby was breech, and doctors were racing against time to keep them both safe. The line was filled with screams, my brother's, Jenna's, even the garbled cries of his newborn, ear-piercing, inhuman. Time seemed to stretch as I sat there frozen, unable to help, unable to block the sound even when I pressed the phone to my chest. Suddenly, the wailing quieted, leaving a chilling silence that vibrated between us. Then Jenna's voice, calm and distant, drifted through the receiver, like she was whispering directly into my ear. "It had to be this way," she murmured, and I hung up in horror. Before I could process what was happening, the nursery filled with a cacophony of sound, an ethereal cacophony of that lullaby woven with a chorus of voices. Something changed then, dark and unnatural. Aurora's bassinet moved of its own accord, and a figure materialized, formless but possessing an aura that made me retch. I grabbed Aurora before the bassinet crushed against the crib, splintering. Ryan shouted, grabbing my arm, pulling me backward just as shadows surged towards us, growling menacingly. With Aurora in my grip, we fled the house, the chorus of the forgotten lullaby chasing us into the night. We haven't returned since. The footage we showed to whoever would listen was called a trick of the light, a corrupted file. But Ryan and I know the truth. I may have acted selfishly, demanding my mom's presence. I may have disrupted a necessary balance, igniting a series of events that were never meant to be. Now Jenna and her child are otherworldly whispers on the wind, and my once beloved mom is untraceable, leaving behind a home engulfed in haunting melodies and flickering shadows. So, am I the asshole for wanting my mother's help? Or was our need for her presence an echo in a family curse, beckoning back something that should have remained forgotten? If mistakes were made, I say they were mine to bear, but the cost, oh, the cost, is something I wouldn't wish on my darkest fears. In the eerie silence, as I hold my daughter close, I pray the lullabies don't follow us anew. I'm not sure where to start, so I'll just dive right in. My name is Kyle. I'm 31 years old, and my life makes less sense every morning I wake up. It's not the usual existential dread most people my age drown in, this is something beyond that, something I can barely comprehend myself. Until last month, I worked in a cubicle farm, the kind where people sit, slowly turning into husks under the fluorescent glare and false sense of productivity. But something changed that afternoon. It was just another mundane Tuesday. People were shuffling in from their lunch breaks, with stale coffee cups clutched closely as if they were holy relics, trying to squeeze out the last few ounces of whatever was left of their souls to get through another workday. My mind was in a haze, a dull gray fog that had become all too familiar. My phone buzzed, breaking the monotony as I glanced down with little interest. The notification read, "Confession incoming at 3:31 p.m. Annoyed, I dismissed it, chalking it up to some spam. But then, the same notification persisted every half minute, only this time, the texts changed slightly. "Confession, Kyle, open the door at 3:31 p.m. It was unnerving, the specificity of it, yet my curiosity was piqued despite the knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. Time crawled by, as I watched the clock's hands twitch towards 3:31 p.m. Exactly at that second, a loud knock came from the office door, odd since visitors weren't allowed without appointments. People seemed oblivious, noses buried in screens, drones only concerned with their own grind. With bated breath I got up, drawn by an inexplicable urge to answer it. I turned the knob slowly, feeling as if I was on the brink of unveiling some grand, uncanny truth behind reality. The door swung open onto a hallway I'd never seen before, definitely not the stale corridor of my office floor. It was drenched in shadow, yet distinctly alive, humming with an unseen energy that made the hairs on my flesh stand on end. And that's when I saw it. A reflection of myself staring back at me from a pool of dark water seeping from between the ancient stone tiles. But this figure was disheveled, hollow-cheeked with darkness pooling beneath its eyes, and it was whispering something in a cadence I couldn't comprehend, yet instinctively knew was meant for me. In those murmurings, I heard fragments of a life not entirely my own, parents who tightened their reins too hard, the pressure to exceed in everything but the crumbling under the weight of their expectations, visions of late nights under a single lamp, poring over books that held no answers, a series of lonely weekends where the silence pressed in like a tangible force. My reflection then did the unthinkable, it blinked, and as its eyes opened, they were clear with a resolution I didn't possess. I was transfixed, caught completely out of time and place, wondering if this was some twisted Halloween prank pulled by a miserable co-worker. The reflection spoke, coldly, yet with a familiarity that gnawed at my insides. "Kyle, you're not alone in this confession. But you must see the truth of yourself before it's too late." Without realizing, I was in the hallway. The office behind me vanished. I arrived at a crossroads, with the hallway stretching infinitely on either side, lined with countless doors almost identical in every way. The only sound was a soft patter, like distant rain, drawing nearer. The shadows grew deeper, swallowing the ends of the hallway like some creeping abyss. A weight settled over me, too stifling to ignore. When I moved toward a particular door, drawn by an unseen force. This door bore a nameplate: Kyle Jennings, my name, and beneath it, the words that have haunted me ever since, eternal confession. Something inside commanded me to turn away, but my hand steadied itself against the knob, mind clouded with unresolved memories and the message my doppelganger imparted me. I pushed it open and instantly felt a vortex of memory surge through. I was there, standing acutely aware of replications of pivotal moments where I could almost feel my past selves making the same mistakes. Down another hallway, and another, each door marked with phases of my life, birthdays forgotten, friendships neglected, dreams unfulfilled. Where time curved in on itself, I saw the specters of those I wronged. Haunting eyes burned into mine as if asking for justification I didn't possess. Cold realization washed over me, rapidly expanding into a deafening roar of self-confrontation. All the blame, regret, the oppressive weight of expectations, and the inevitable isolation of my ego. I was trapped, alongside phantoms equally lost to their confessions. I had unwittingly stumbled into a limbo of contrition, every door a confessional unto itself. This wasn't just for me, it was an interstice where those who had reached their breaking point chose to pause, caught between moving on and confessing their truths. Panic rose, clawing at my throat, but deep within, a strange sense of belonging also fluttered, a mirror of acknowledgement. Here was a quaint space crafted from exponential despair, yet weirdly comforting, a testament that I was not alone in my solitude. A dim light flickered from down the hall where the shadows began, and within that subtle glow, amidst whispers of the countless before me, There was a choice, either to embrace it, succumb, and drift eternally lost, or turn around, face the darkened path left behind, and reclaim fragments littered with tentative hopes and renewal. Standing there at the edge of where comprehension and relinquishment blurred, I realized what must be done. It wasn't about finding the point in going on, perhaps it was about living with the uncertainty, finding meaning in the echoes even when they were veiled. The path didn't have to be clear, but it had to be traversed. I took one backward glance into the depths of missed confessions before striding purposefully back, embracing each silent step forward. If this place could exist, then perhaps I could write my own confession on a blank page, not bound by echoes but by the authentic desire to strive onwards despite the fog. Maybe, just maybe, that's where I might begin to see my point. When I was 7, there was this sunless November day when the power failed, leaving our elementary school trapped in twilight. The darkness seemed to seep in through the cracks in the old gymnasium where a whole school assembly was underway. It was so quiet that even the whisper of crumpled lunch bags amidst hundreds of breathing kids felt like a nervous secret passed around, too frightened to be spoken aloud. As Mrs. Collins stood on stage, diligently reading announcements, her voice crackled over the PA, its echo bouncing off the high arching ceiling, drowning us in monotony and expectation. But for some reason, on that particular day, everything felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your skin itch, your throat dry up, and your brain feel like too many channels yelling at once. At some point, I felt the vibrato of the room shift and then everything faded into a hushed buzzing. The last thing I remember seeing was the flicker of the failing fluorescent lights as they strobed in and out of life above me. All at once, the world blurred, and I remember everything swimming before me in waves before it all unraveled. I woke to the sensation of something rough and metallic against my hand, a taste of pennies in my mouth, and a faint, faraway drone that could have been the hum of 1,000 flies, or the breathless whispers of kids frozen in morbid fascination. Above me, a concerned yet unrecognizable face hovered, a teacher, maybe, or a nurse, and for a moment, my life was merely a cacophony of murmured conspiracies. The story of my fainting spread faster than the flu that winter. I became the kid who blacked out at school, and with it, came the stories, the rumors, and worse, the shadows whispering things I couldn't control. In classes, I felt eyes stabbing through me. In hallways, clusters of students parted as if expecting lightning to follow in my wake. I heard murmurs, maybe he's sick, and more unsettling ones, maybe he's haunted. Each day felt heavier than the last, laden with speculation lodged like stones in my chest, impossible to dislodge. Eventually, the rumor mutated, spiraling into something far more sinister. Kids started swearing they saw me wandering the halls after the blackout with vacant eyes. They described encounters with me in places I had never been, the bathrooms, the art supply closet, even the boiler room, a place I didn't even know existed until then. They talked about seeing my silhouette hunched in corners or scribbling in books with frantic energy. No amount of pleading could convince them I hadn't seen or been such places. Their accounts were terrifyingly precise, narrations detached from reality yet detailed in a way that left me questioning the solidity of my own perceptions. Determined to untangle the myth from reality, I began eavesdropping, piecing together the wandering shadows' movements that were attributed to me. Each story clashed with everything I knew of myself while aligning terrifyingly well with an itinerary that painted a fractured map of our school. At the hilt of rumors was one persisting notion, the idea that anyone who engaged with my shadow self felt a hollow emptiness echo within them, a sense of being less afterwards. Kids crossed themselves when I passed, making jokes with razor-edged humor about possession or being from the other side. Things spiraled into a sinister territory, tethered to an ancient and unnoticed infrastructure of tethering whispers that led to hushed adults and glances I couldn't quite catch. I started noticing the small things, patterns carved into desks, small tetrahedral shapes subtly painted over the old wooden beams in the hallways, engulfed in cobwebs. A scratch against theory assumed dismissed, the idea our school harbored ghosts emerged, and what began as a series of quotes hastily dismissed became undeniable when Amelia, the school's brightest, claimed the shadow spoke. According to her intricate retelling, she saw me standing alone in the music room, fingers absorbing the notes of an ancient melody bruised into black keys. The shadow turned, she said, and spoke in a voice burdened by time, warning of something, the danger lurking at thresholds between worlds beneath. Amelia's revelation lit the dwindled embers of ghost stories past, earning her sympathy instead of scorn, a luxury I wasn't afforded. In a confrontation where reality and myth unpredictably intertwined, I decided to confront this double. One weekend, ignoring the muffled ticking clock, I crept into the school under the cover of an early dusk-driven storm. Waves of coldness guided me on, The echo of footsteps, mine? Following closer than they should. The corridors were quieter than they'd ever been, silencing an awakening shiver to ripple through the fabric of my bravery, but I couldn't stop. I moved towards the music room, the proclaimed haunt, and with each step the air grew heavier, breathing felt like inhaling night itself. Pushing the door open, a palpable chill grappled me, and sitting there, half-draped in shadows cast by the storm, was the cryptid me. It was ethereal, intangible in form yet manifestly present, wearing my face but more ash than flesh, more absence than being. Sitting at the aged piano, it struck dissonant chords thick with sorrow, melodies twisted into haunting sonatas. In those discordant notes flooded memories, echoes of the whispers that fluttered around me. It turned its gaze, a mirror reflecting everything I had avoided seeing, and that voice, my own yet saturated with despair and echoes of forgotten dreams, warned again, telling of a boundary thinning, a convergence where things lurking long in the shadows might finally see light through our merging worlds. I stood encased in fear and fascination, knowing on an instinctual level that I had found the source, the legacy of an old haunting tethered by the keystones of our school. As the storm abated and the room gradually lightened, the me dissolved, dissipating as if it was a construct of fear itself shattering in the birth of truth. The next days were a blur punctuated by questions and stories. The once shadow that cast over me simply ceased, and the rumors of a kid who blacked out subsided into stories forgotten with the leaving of one autumn and the coming of spring. Yet, in the quiet remnants of silence when days are too short and nights stretch too long, I still hear the haunting harmony, that warning woven into otherworldly music echoing from beneath, and I wonder if it might resurface, recognize me as once before. Though unseen since, the school remains encased in its own narrative of echoes, where somewhere in between the notes, my story, our story, waits unplayed. I never thought I'd end up turning to the internet for something like this, but the shadows in our little farmhouse have grown unnervingly long, and I can't shake the feeling that there's something unspeakable lurking just behind my sister's pleasant gaze. It all began when Sarah moved in with us after the birth of her baby, David. My husband, Tom, and I live a quiet life on the edge of a thick, ancient forest in upstate New York, a setting both beautiful and eerie, especially during the onset of autumn. Initially, I was thrilled to have my younger sister around. We were always close, and having her stay with us during such an important time seemed like the natural thing to do. But soon after she moved in, I started noticing things, or, rather, the absence of things that should have been there. The farmhouse had always been peaceful, yet it wasn't long before an unsettling silence settled over everything, a quiet that made the hairs on my neck prickle while tending to mundane chores like hanging clothes to dry or stirring soup on the stove. Sarah was breastfeeding David often, and she did so freely, anywhere around the house. As a mother myself, I never found this peculiar, but Sarah's demeanor during those moments felt increasingly strange. There was something in the way she held him, not the typical warmth of a nurturing mother, but an intensity, a focus on him that seemed almost predatory. I dismissed it as postpartum exhaustion at first, but my unease grew with every passing day. The real turning point was one chilly evening when I politely asked Sarah if she'd mind covering up a bit while breastfeeding, not out of prudishness, but because Tom was visibly uncomfortable one evening during dinner, his eyes darting away with a tension that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the house. Sarah gave me a look then, a look so cold and full of malice that it chilled the air around us. She didn't say anything at first, just smiled, a thin, tight-lipped smile that made my stomach twist. "You wouldn't understand," she said softly, more to David than to me, as if the baby held some ancient wisdom that eluded the rest of us. That night, I dreamt of whispers, a soft, slithering sound like hushed voices gibbering in a language I couldn't recognize. I awoke in a cold sweat, the shadows of the room pooling malevolently around the bed. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The feeling lingered the next day, and the growing tension between us was palpable. Things began disappearing around the house, small things at first, like paperweights or keys. Then, more disturbing ones, such as the crucifix above our bed and the old clock pendulum we inherited from Tom's grandmother. The missing items inexplicably faded from memory, and I couldn't figure out why I felt relieved every time one vanished. The forest, normally a comforting embrace of deciduous giants, now loomed like a writhing entity pressing against our windows, its presence invasive and overbearing. I took to closing the curtains, shutting out the sight of the gnarled trees reaching toward us like cursed fingers. Meanwhile, Sarah never left the house, her attention devoted entirely to David, who cooed and giggled in a language of his own that seemed to resonate with the murmurs from my dreams. I grew desperate, confiding in Tom, who insisted it was merely postpartum stress affecting us all. I wanted to believe him, but thought I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. That horrific suspicion was confirmed one bone-chilling night. Woken by what sounded like soft singing, I slipped silently downstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath my cautious steps. I followed the eerie melody to the living room and froze. Moonlight slashed through the window, illuminating a tableau that should have been ordinary but was instead terribly wrong. Sarah sat cross-legged, hair tousled and wild, eyes reflecting the moon's cold glow. She wasn't singing to David but whispering, those same forbidden intonations from my dreams, and he wasn't asleep. His eyes, somehow mature and knowing, seemed to nod along with her voice. I gasped unintentionally, and instantly the atmosphere shifted. Sarah's head snapped up, eyes burning with a cyclopean ferocity I'd only seen in my darkest nightmares. "He's ours now," she whispered, voice suddenly layered with an echoic resonance that vibrated through the air, setting my teeth on edge. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "What do you mean?" I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady, though panic clawed at my insides. Sarah stood, cradling David with inhuman strength, and as she rose, shadows bled from the corners, coiling around her like sentient tendrils. "You wanted me to cover up, didn't you? Well, there are things, secrets meant to stay hidden from unbelieving eyes." Her voice wasn't hers anymore, it had taken on a sepulchral timbre that thrummed with preternatural authority. I backed away instinctively, my heart racing, every primal sense screaming to flee. But something heavy anchored my feet to the floor, compelling me to listen, to understand. Before I could blink, Sarah whispered an elegiac phrase that burrowed deep into my psyche, and I collapsed, consciousness slipping away like a receding tide. I awoke to Tom shaking me, daylight flooding the room, erasing the oppressive night and its encroaching dread. "It was a dream," he insisted as he led me upstairs, his arm wrapped protectively around me. Yet, his eyes remained clouded with doubt. Sarah and David were gone when I awoke that afternoon, without a trace left behind except for the memory that gnawed at my sanity like a rabid beast. I scourged the house and the nearby woods for hints of my sister and nephew, but all I found were the missing objects, returned to their places, none the worse for wear. Despite my insistence, Tom refused to accept what I saw. But I know, deep in my bones, that the forest watches, waiting for me to see again what I've mindlessly begged to forget. And now I remember why I turned to Reddit, as some part of me prays that collective eyes can confront the truth those wild woods have already claimed from me. As for Sarah and David, I fear they are beyond our reach, swathed forever in those murmurings that promise only hidden visions and infinite dread. Confession time, my memory is a lot worse than I let anyone know. You might think that's just me covering up for your typical forgetful habits, like leaving keys in the fridge or missing birthdays, but it's way beyond that. It started subtly during my last semester of college. I'd find myself misplacing things or spacing out during conversations. My friends called it senioritis, but it felt different. I would lose entire chunks of time, blanking out only to find myself in places I didn't recognize, as if someone hit a skip button on my life. I tried to brush it off. Who wouldn't? Convince yourself there's nothing wrong, just stress or fatigue, but denial only works for so long. My roommate, Kyle, was the first to call me on it. "Bro, you just disappeared for hours yesterday. Where'd you go?" His words jolted me because I had no clue. I laughed it off, saying I needed some air, but I hadn't left my bed all day, or at least, I think I hadn't. I decided to keep a journal to track these gaps, like what the psychologists suggest, right? Maybe I was just recording my descent into madness, little sketches of absence detailing places and faces I didn't remember meeting at times I couldn't account for. But the gaps weren't just in time anymore. I began waking up with scars, shallow, thin like paper cuts tracing patterns on my arms. Once, I awoke with dirt under my nails and a lingering scent of earth clinging to me as if I'd clawed up from a grave. Still, I kept it under wraps. I couldn't lose my job over unfounded fears, and more importantly, I couldn't admit the depth of my fear. Then, last Tuesday, something happened that I can't ignore. I came to an unfamiliar apartment building. I was in front of a door, key in hand, poised to enter as if I lived there, and that's when I heard whispering. Holding my breath, I pressed my ear against the cold door, the wood vibrating with soft murmurs of a conversation too low to understand. That's when I remembered more vividly. I'd been here before, outside this very door many times, though I never recalled stepping inside. I had no idea who or what awaited me on the other side. Panic gripped me, more lifelike than anything else felt in those days, forcing clarity into my fogged-over mind, and I bolted. I've been retracing my steps ever since, the rare few I remember, to recover my past. Kyle noticed the anxiety shadowing me as if I'd been marked by something unseen. He suggested adopting a pet, a grounding mechanism. The familiarity would help, he said. But something inside me feared what I'd do if I blacked out around a living thing incapable of judgment. What if No, I'd rather not dwell on that possibility. My efforts to understand dragged me to online forums, a futile quest for similar stories lost in narrative threads and strange coincidences. I found a post by a user, Shadow Skip, detailing their own experiences, eerily similar to mine, down to location-specific incidents. Without overthinking, I messaged them. We needed to connect, share our puzzle pieces. Their response chilled me. We shouldn't meet. It'll make it worse. They always find you when you remember. I never sleep peacefully now, and the new scars seeping red are hard to dismiss. I think I'm unraveling. I got an email from a stranger yesterday. No subject, just a link. I hesitated, hovered over the link, and finally clicked. A live feed, grainy and dark, like old security footage. My heart stopped as I saw someone entering the apartment from my vision, a figure clothed in shadow, but as they turned to the camera, even in the blur, it was unmistakably me. Monday's just around the corner, and I dread waking up in front of that door again. I've stopped journaling, abandoned all narratives of then and now, trying only to survive where reality and forgetfulness blur with each breath. Maybe this is my confession, or a cry for help, or a simple warning: beware the memory gaps. And if you ever hear whispering outside a door you don't remember, don't enter. For now, I'll keep pretending, hoping this message reaches someone before it's too late, just like it was for Shadow Skip.